Okay, they are confirming me that all it's okay. Welcome to this second scheduled webinar of the Forensic Schedule Analysis course developed by EPCM Project Academy. My name is Mayley Salinas, and I will be helping in the management of questions and answers. We welcome our students from Latin America, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, and in the Middle East, as well as to our followers in YouTube channel. Thanks for joining into this second course. Some rules for before starting: raise your hand if someone wants to add a comment on the case under discussion. And remember that the questions have been selected from our different students, and we have a defined time for one of them. Without more to say, I will leave our teacher, Mark Sander, an expert on the subject. Go ahead, Mark. Good morning.
Hello, Miley. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Looks like I am going to start sharing my screen here. And let me just share my primary screen, and I'll go to the PowerPoint quickly here and just let me know if I'm good to go, Miley.
Sorry, Mark, please. Could you?
Is that good? Can everybody see my screen? I'll minimize my Zoom here. How's that?
Mark?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, it's correct. Please check your audio, please.
How's that?
It's a little low.
A little low. Okay, let me see.
Now it's basically clear for us. For me, it's clear.
Okay.
For you, it's clear. Let me know if I need to change it. Audio settings. How's that, everybody? Miley, is that good?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay. If it's unclear at all, I can change my microphone. So just let me know. If anybody has any problems, just please comment, make a comment on the problems, and we'll adjust. Okay. All right, so yeah, let's get started. Sorry for the few minutes delay there. Hopefully everything will be in good shape, but we got a number of good comments here, some complex ones on some advanced topics. So I'm gonna try and do a few examples. Please feel free to jump in and give some feedback on what you think is valuable. I can do some examples and we can have a little bit of discussion. Let's get started here. There we go. Okay, so because these questions today are a little bit more complicated and they touch on issues that could be treated in a lot of different ways depending on your contract and depending on your jurisdiction, I thought it would be valuable to spend a little bit of time talking about underlying concepts here. So these concepts, they're arguably common law concepts that aren't applicable in every country, but I'm going to take an approach here as a schedule analyst and as an engineer and just talk to you about setting up an analytical framework for yourself. So I've taken a couple of comments that you might say, well, these don't necessarily apply to me because they're common law concepts, and that's okay. I think the underlying guidance here is you need to understand what concepts do apply to you for the treatment of things like concurrency. We had some questions in here that we'll go through related to the ideas of functional or literal concurrency. I think that it's an important concept to understand. And in terms of how that is going to play out in something like an arbitration, it could very much be affected by any applicable legal precedent or the arbitrator's own views of how to assess concurrency. So there aren't necessarily hard and fast rules. There are some schools of thought on these things, for example, with functional and literal concurrency, that I think you should be familiar with. And as an analyst, I think you should understand the pros and cons of each school of thought, when they might be applied in each situation, and how you might make an objective and well-reasoned decision on how to apply a particular analytical approach, regardless of the underlying law. That said, I think it's also important to understand that the underlying law might have more of an effect on the decision than your very reasoned analysis. And in fact, you know, I could point out a few cases, even recent ones that are interesting, where, you know, I think the decision is not a particularly good one. We have the statement, sometimes you might hear that bad facts make bad law. You know, in the common law, we try to rely on precedent to tell us how courts might rule in the future. What's challenging in some of these big engineering and construction cases is the underlying facts are very complex and the analysis may be very complex. The triers of fact might be presented with two different versions of a very complex project that might both have some basis in a reasonable approach to analyzing that project, and they're going to make a decision. It's very hard to base future decisions on particular precedents when the underlying facts are very complex. Sometimes I find in our chains of precedents here, even in the US, some contradictory statements, even when the courts believe they're saying the same thing as a prior court. It's very interesting to me, but judges and arbitrators are not necessarily expected to be experts in forensic schedule analysis, nor should they be. That's our job. But also part of our job is to explain what we've done in a clear and convincing manner. And that can be very difficult when the underlying facts are complex. And also when there are different schools of thought, there's not a settled one way to approach an analysis in many of these cases. So that's the underlying framework. Let me give you a little bit of a basis for, you know, something that I think is a reasonable approach. So number one, I said these are common law concepts, but I think even in the Middle East, in South America, I see similar concepts being applied, even though you might say, well, those common law concepts don't apply to me. I think what potentially does apply to everybody who's an engineer or an analyst is this idea of reasoned, rational analysis. So I just want to present some concepts that I think could be applied in a reasoned and rational way, regardless of the underlying law. And that's because, you know, I have seen contracts in the Middle East and in South America where, although the common law might not govern them in any sense, it doesn't necessarily in any sense here in the United States either, because everyone is free to contract for the most part as they see fit. So what I say here is that any of these concepts could be applied or they could be modified or even completely avoided in most jurisdictions, depending on the contract. So you could write a contract that explicitly states how concurrent delay is going to be treated with respect to risk sharing in the event of concurrent delays. And people have tried to do that. That is also very challenging to do, because as much as people might try to write, this is how we're going to manage this risk, when two things are happening concurrently, it's very hard to write something that's very clear, that's going to be applied exactly as the parties think it's going to be applied. But why do we have delays at all? And I shared a set of papers, I think, with the last group that we did, that we'll also share with this group. So Miley, that all the references, both the list of books, the short list of books, and the list and the group of papers that we shared recently with the Spanish group, these are all English language materials, but they should also be shared with this group. There are a number of papers in there that treat especially concurrent delay, because it's a well-discussed subject, if not a resolved subject. But the reason we can have delay is because there are promises in our contract. So something that we would call a covenant, and there might be there are two types really, a dependent or an independent covenant. But if you execute a contract where the contractor is going to build a house by December 31st and the buyer or the owner is going to pay $100,000 for that house, then what happens? That's a promise, and it's a dependent promise because both sides have promised something. The contractor has promised to deliver a house by December 31st, and the owner has promised to pay $100,000. In a perfect situation, the house is built by December 31st, the owner pays $100,000 and everybody is happy. What happens if the contractor builds the house and the owner says, I'm not going to pay you? Well, that's a breach of a promise. It's a breach of a covenant. And then the contractor is going to perhaps sue in court, take them to arbitration, whatever the case may be, to try and recover that $100,000 and maybe more for this breach. There are also conditions, though. Let's say that in this contract, it says, I will build the house by December 31st, and then you will pay me. That's a condition that means first the contractor has to build the house, and then the owner is obligated to pay him the $100,000. So let's say December 31st comes and the contractor says, hey, the house is almost done. I just have a few little things left to do, but I need you to pay me. Could you please pay me? The owner might say, no, because you haven't fulfilled your promise yet. And until you fulfill your promise, I don't need to pay you. The owner and the contractor are free to write whatever contract they want in terms of the promises they make to each other. And when they sign it, those are the promises we try to enforce. If the owner in my example did not pay the contractor, that would be a breach, and it would be a major breach because what the contractor is getting, the entirety of what the contractor is getting here is $100,000. If he's denied receipt of that $100,000, we say it goes to the essence of the contract. That's everything that he expected. So there are broadly two types of breaches: major or material breaches that go to the essence of the contract, and minor breaches. So let's say that the contractor built the house, but he wasn't done on December 31st as required. He finished on January 7th, 7 days late. That is probably not a major breach. It's probably a minor breach. He built the whole house, but he was a little bit late. So the owner might say, you didn't keep your promise. I'm not going to pay you. But that clearly would be unjust for the owner to get the house for free based on this minor breach. So what the contractor is normally entitled to, as opposed to, what the owner is normally entitled to, as opposed to not paying at all, the owner is going to collect damages for this minor breach. Now, in very complex projects, it might be very difficult for the owner to calculate how he was actually damaged. You know, what was the cost of not being able to be in the house for 7 days? Did he have to get a hotel room? Was that hotel room reasonable? Did he stay at a 5-star hotel? And is he trying to recover that full cost? So there could be arguments over these things. So what happens is the owner might say, and this happens certainly in complex construction projects, the owner might say, I'm going to stipulate in the contract ahead of time that if you're late on these particular milestones, I will collect a damage of $1,000 a day. And this is what we call a liquidated damage clause, right? Liquidated because he's put a specific monetary amount on each day of delay, as opposed to trying to calculate the damage only in the event of a breach. So the contractor agrees up front, if I'm late, and in this case, he was 7 days late, so the owner deducts $7,000 and pays the contractor $93,000. And that seems to be consistent with what the contractor envisioned for this late delivery. He delivered late, so he only gets $93,000. We also have this idea of putting this clause in the contract where we say time is of the essence. And what does that mean? To me, it's a very short and vague sentence, but what the owners typically who are putting that in the contract are trying to do is by saying time is of the essence, they're saying that if you deliver late, that goes to the essence of the contract. So if you deliver the house late, not only is it a minor breach, but it's potentially a material breach, because I have written into this contract the idea that time goes to the heart of what I want. And if I don't get what I want on a particular date, the damage is so great that I believe you've breached the entire contract. Why might you do that? Well, people do it a lot and probably too much. But I think, you might do that. Let's say this wasn't a house, but this was a stage for a celebration, for a concert performance to celebrate the new year. And it had to be delivered by December 31st because the concert was scheduled for January 1st. And there were 1,000 people coming and they were going to pay $150 a ticket, right? So the idea that the owner had was to pay this contractor $100,000 to build the stage. And then he was going to sell 1,000 tickets and make a $50,000 profit. Well, the contractor delivers the stage on January 7th, and the owner says, the stage is now worthless to me because the new year has passed. I have been damaged, and this is the essence of what I wanted is not a stage. The essence of what I wanted is a stage by January 1st, and it was critical to me. You've breached the entire contract by delivering late. In our construction contracts, often, they want to treat every delay practically as a material breach. The truth is, most of these things, if you're late on a particular milestone, will be treated as more minor breaches where one party can collect damages. So our job is to sort all this stuff out and say, who was late, why, and who's entitled to damages. So that's my underlying framework there. As we get into things like concurrency, I think it's important to have some kind of underlying framework. That's a general framework that I've given you on being late, collecting damages, et cetera. You need to understand, I think, to answer some of these questions regarding concurrency, what's my underlying framework? What part of these concepts apply to me in my jurisdiction, in my contract? And then you can start to build an analytical framework that's consistent with that underlying legal framework. And I think that's how you'll be able to solve some of these problems in a way that'll be compelling in your particular jurisdiction or in your particular arbitration forum. So understand the rules that apply is very important here, because I'll give you answers on concurrency, but it's whether or not the answer is right could be very dependent on the underlying legal framework and the jurisdiction. But this stuff, again, is very broad worldwide, and it hasn't been 100% solved. So there's no reason we can't present a consistent approach at the analytical level and hope that the majority of triers of fact in the world agree with our consistent approach to these issues and accept it. We haven't even developed a 100% consistent approach in analyzing things like concurrency yet, in my opinion. So, you're going to see a mix of opinions around the world because there's no one answer to these questions. I'm going to give you mine. All right. Starting with Srijas's question, and this goes to the UAE. So this really speaks directly to the idea of literal versus functional. And I really think we needed the underlying framework to answer that. So, and especially because he gets into an arbitration here. So we don't know what's going to happen in the arbitration, but we want to present that compelling, reasonable, objective, and well-structured argument. So here's his project. In one of my projects, the construction is done for a building in 3 separate parts independently, and there are joints between the parts. The sequences follow independent paths until the services are to be integrated at later stages. So mechanical, electrical, plumbing type things between these 3 buildings, I take it. Delays are operating on 2 parts. Delay on one part is under the responsibility of the employer or owner related to some changes that came out for a raft sump portion of the project. Sounds like maybe a drainage or plumbing sump at the bottom of the building. We can get details. And delay on another part is under the contractor's responsibility, poor quality of reinforcement work, which leads to redoing a portion of the works. Okay. When the concurrency is looked at literally, I can conclude one of them was critical. However, a more functional argument would be that both of these delays were independent and would have delayed the project completion independently. Above is just one example, and there's many situations where is a sole responsible critical delays, in which case there will be little concurrency. So if you're asked to provide a risk assessment report, it sounds like you should look at them both ways. You can give me feedback on what this risk assessment report needs to be, but I will say that if you're assessing how the arbitration might go, you want to apply a purely literal look at concurrency and say, this would be the result if I was strictly literal, and then apply a broad functional approach and say, this might be the result if a more functional approach was applied, and try to give a range of possible results and estimate how probable they are. I think you could take the functional view to an extremely unreasonable position and say that that's very unlikely. You could take the literal view to parsing things, literally by the hour and say that's unlikely. I don't think it's unlikely, depending on the nature of these delays, that you could parse down to the day, though. So, I think there's a high probability, depending on the level of detail that you have, that you can isolate delays in something like a commercial construction building, even a complex one. But you're going to have to look at the details of your project. Should you treat them functionally or literally? So we're going to send you a group of papers to read, and we're going to go through an example, hopefully today, that'll help you try to make that decision. I think for risk analysis, you should do both. But it depends on how intertwined the delays are. So they could be intertwined and, physically, meaning there's just no way to figure out which particular construction activity is more critical at any one time. People are working right on top of each other, a lot of different potential problems. But it sounds like here, they're independent, different parts of the building, and they're intertwined more temporally. So you have delays that are more or less unrelated, especially here you have one construction quality delay and one scope change delay. So unrelated, not really impacting each other, but happening at the same time and both independently impacting the project. So they're temporarily intertwined. What we would do in the US is try to isolate them. And to the extent we could isolate a particular party was responsible for delay on a particular day, we would try to assign responsibility to that party for that day of delay. Now, functional versus literal, it all depends on what underlying data you have and your view of delay. So if you have daily reports, if you have good schedule updates that are high quality, where you can tell who's making progress on a particular day and who is not, there's a good chance you can isolate these things. But you have some issues here in terms of when to treat starts of delay. So for example, poor quality of reinforcement work led to redoing the work. Well, when the initial work was installed at a low level of quality, it theoretically created a delay as soon as it was installed, because later it would need to come out, right? How do we treat the timing of delay is very important. Usually, and I'll give you a kind of a rational rule to use, but if you want to be rational, you need to be consistent. Usually we treat the timing of events as having occurred when people find out about them. And there's good reasons for that, because these projects are complex. People are making decisions theoretically every day. And to say that a delay occurred a month ago, but nobody knew about it, is kind of a little ridiculous, because if they didn't know about it, they couldn't have changed their plan. And we need to remember, plans are dynamic and change based on new information. So as soon as we get new information, I might change the plan, which is going to affect the critical path. So I would treat it, without knowing the details of your project, as a general rule, and then wanting to find a more specific rule. As a general rule, I would say the construction quality delay happens the day that I realize I've got a quality issue that I need to do extra work on, and we've got to address it. And here's the new plan. Now I know how long it's going to take. I can start to make those decisions. Did it happen in the same week? Did it happen in the same month as change orders related to the sump? For me, if I have information that I could parse down to the day, I'm going to treat things literally. So for example, and I think there's a good argument for that, on Tuesday, if I find out that there's a significant amount of concrete work that needs to be redone, and I'm going to need another 2 weeks on the overall project to do that concrete work, and at the end of the day, Tuesday, I know that, and there's no getting around it, then the project was delayed on Tuesday. If the next day the owner comes to me and says, I want to change the sump, and that's going to make the whole project take 1 week longer, but it's not going to because I just had this 2 week delay, then to me, there's no additional delay. Why? You know, and I don't know all the details here. Why? Well, because once the project was delayed 2 weeks and I said there's no way to get it back, now the owner making that change to the sump and using some of that 2 week period, if it doesn't affect what's going on with the concrete rework, didn't actually cause any additional delay. For the contractor to turn around and say, oh, well now, you know, half of this delay is your fault because you changed the sump, doesn't make any sense to me. If, on the other hand, the contractor came and said, you know, wait a minute, there's a way to work around this 2 week delay. I can do some things in parallel and I could recover it. And then the owner created a 1 week delay. Now the contractor could say, wait a minute, you know, now this is your delay. So the timing of things is extremely
Hello, Mark. We can hear you. Please check your audio.
Hello there. There is no audio at this end.
Hello, how's this for audio? Can somebody validate audio?
Yes, it's okay.
Is that good? Anybody else have any problems with audio?
Yes, it's okay now.
Okay, let's use this audio. All right, so that's a discussion of literal versus functional concurrency. I can move on from this, and I think maybe getting into the example. Let's try and go through some of these questions in addition, and then we'll get into the example, which hopefully will help answer this. And I apologize if the audio cuts out for any reason. Please speak up because I'm pointless if you can't hear me, right? All right, let's continue. Tech is not cooperating today. Okay. Application of 3.3 and 3.4 when the critical path is practically incorrect. In many scenarios of the day, delays will have to be assessed by comparing against programs that are updated without the necessary logic corrections. So we have another example here. This one is related to shop drawing activities. They're linked to their corresponding trades, and shop drawing preparation is flowing through the floors or areas of the building. In addition to these links, which are called soft logic links here, I think we're speaking to the crew flows. There's an assumption that each shop drawing will require 2 iterations before it is approved. Okay, a lot of people put those types of assumptions into their drawing approval processes. A review of the program update shows shop drawing is driving project completion for many successive program updates, but the soft logic between successive floors, and I'm assuming this is a separate path through crew flow because we're saying soft logic, with 2 iterations on each of them is making this item critical. Or soft logic between different drawing submittals. In hindsight, as apparent shop drawings were approved, activity was completed ahead of site readiness, and the actual delay can be judged as site execution works. However, the review of contemporaneous updates would show shop drawings on the critical path. How do we address this scenario where an incorrect sequence comes up on critical path? Incorrect is a word I'm going to focus in on here. So this is a conclusion. You know, you're saying that the sequence on the critical path is incorrect. So I'm going to try and give a general logic framework here. How do we know that something is incorrect? Because we have another basis of data, another basis of information that we believe is correct. So we take that basis of data, we compare it to, in this case, the CPM schedule, and we conclude that because we have something that we know is correct, the CPM schedule is incorrect. What is this other basis of data? It's the real world, but in the case of delay, it's an interpretation of what's happening in the real world. So CPM schedules are models, and we have a saying that all models are wrong, some models are useful. So all models are incorrect. It's not surprising that a CPM schedule is incorrect in some sense, because no CPM schedule exactly shows what's going on in the real world. So there are arguably all errors in CPM schedules. I have a paper this year that is shared with this group of papers on the theory of delay that really speaks to some of these esoteric issues in terms of what is delay, that I think is good reading. But it gets a little academic. You know, what we really need is a set of principles that we can apply. So how do we apply a set of principles? What I think we need to do here, because this is a course on forensic schedule analysis, so we do need to analyze the schedules. We talk a lot about in recommended practice 29R3 that some schedules are so bad, so incorrect, contain so many errors that we need to throw them out entirely. So you can look at your source validation protocols, and you need to make a decision with regard to your schedules on all your projects. Is it a schedule that you can analyze? Is it a schedule that you can't analyze until you correct some critical error? Or is it a schedule that completely doesn't represent what's actually going on in the real world to the point where you need to throw it out? You can't analyze it at all. So there's a decision you need to make on the front end before beginning your analysis, or maybe early on in your analysis iterations to decide what's the quality of this schedule and how useful is it going to be to analyze. Again, very fact specific, but what do we prefer to have an objective basis that's compelling where we can convince a trier of fact? If we throw out the schedules on the front end and say the schedules are wrong, what I'm telling you is right, that's a less well supported argument in general. So I think our preference as analysts should be to use the information that we have, but we always have to be mindful that we don't want to incorporate bad or incorrect information. So a dramatic, and Sri just asked about risk analysis early on. I think if we get to the end of the spectrum on the decisions we could make, our risks are probably higher. At the end of the spectrum on schedule quality, completely throwing out a schedule and saying it's entirely wrong is probably as far as we could go. Completely accepting all data in the schedule as 100% correct is probably as far as we could go on the other end of the spectrum. Here we have a schedule that has problems. What's the best thing to do? What I like to do is analyze the schedule as I receive it, including all its problems, and then analyze the problems against the real world. So I would do your whole schedule analysis and show that the shop drawings are creating all this delay in the schedule analysis, and then compare the results of that analysis to what's going on in the real world and explain in detail why, in fact, that's not the case in the real world. This will be a fair amount of work for you, but it will force you to develop a very detailed argument as to why what the schedule shows is critical is not actually what's critical in the real world. In order to break down this conclusion that the schedule is incorrect, it would be helpful to be supported by things like contemporaneous discussions by the project parties from a meeting minute or emails or letters. And if those meeting minutes are exclusively focused on these site execution delays and say things like, we need more resources for excavation, we're falling way behind, and nobody mentions this idea that shop drawings are behind, that certainly is good evidence that the shop drawings were not what was driving the project, because that's not what people were talking about contemporaneously. certainly the approved shop drawings themselves, if you can produce these approved shop drawings and reference the dates and say, the schedule shows that this shop drawing is going to take another 2 months, but the approved shop drawing is already on site. Here's the transmittal letter. Well, that completely changes the story from what the critical path shows, and will no doubt support exactly your argument here that it was the site works that are critical. You might take these schedules and say, I'm going to analyze these schedules, but I'm going to incorporate these actual dates. And this is how you would do a schedule analysis anyway. You look for actual dates, not just from what comes from the schedule update, but what comes from things like daily reports, shop drawing approval logs, and things like that. You take your update, and where it shows that a shop drawing needs 2 more revisions, meanwhile, it's already been approved and is out on site, you put in your approval date, you mark all that whole chain of activities as 100% complete, if in fact they are, and you show what it does to the schedule. So that's how you would address this situation. Speaking broadly here, I don't like the idea of just generally saying this schedule is wrong or incorrect, and I don't think that's what you're proposing here. I like the idea of pointing out the specific problems with the schedule, pointing out your specific sources for another basis of truth, identifying the deviations between the real world and the party's schedule model, and then explaining why the shop drawings are not delaying the project. And this will really help you, because if you go in with a very weak argument saying, the schedules are incorrect, there's a lot of errors in them, all the shop drawing dates are wrong, another party might present, well, the schedule was accepted, and if the dates were wrong, somebody should have identified it at the time, and everybody thought the shop drawings were driving the project. You will have needed to have done all the detail analysis to destroy that argument before you walk into the room in arbitration, right? So going through this very detailed path will give you the good basis to destroy those arguments if in fact the schedule is showing something that's not consistent with what's going on in the real world. So do your homework, put the details together, don't throw things out wholesale or on a conclusive manner. Go through all the details and have a well-structured logical argument where everybody can look at you and say, Srijus has done his homework here. What he's saying makes a ton of sense. This schedule doesn't make any sense. I don't agree with the other party. I agree with Srijus, and you should win the argument, right? That's my guidance. How to claim lost time due to the pandemic being an exempted sector. What reference or standard practice the contractor must demonstrate to claim the lost time due to loss of productivity during the COVID-19 lockdown period where the construction sector were exempted. I assume this means in UAE you could continue work, but you must implement strict authority guideline to curb spread by social distancing, sanitation, and many hurdles. This is very interesting. And Tesha Mudden, there have been so many presentations this year on COVID, and I think many of them are still available. I would encourage you to take a look at them. Certainly in a lot of places initially, and my state was one of them, where we shut down construction, but it was only for a short period of time. And then, said, hey, everybody's effectively socially distanced in a lot of construction, particularly outdoor things like utility and highway construction. And they went back to work, but they had problems because manufacturing was shut down and other types of issues. Now we've actually been able to accelerate a lot of construction, particularly in the transportation and utility industries, because there are so many fewer people on the roads. Airport construction, we're trying to accelerate. A lot of things that we can get done with so many fewer people actually not in our transportation facilities. So the effects of COVID have really been not just one, global force majeure, but have varied by area, by type of project, et cetera. There are a lot of presentations. We did one, I did one with Chris Carson and others in the early spring. And I think there's one at least available for free on LinkedIn about, potential effects going forward once you restarted work. There's tons of stuff out there on COVID. How do you claim it? You make the productivity claims in the same way you would make any other type of productivity claim. Explain what was the basis for the conditions under which you expected to execute the contract. Explain what the new conditions are, and explain why they result in productivity losses. If you can do a measured mile because you have good productivity data from before COVID, do a measured mile. If you can't do a measured mile, use one of the other methods. I'm not going to go through the entire productivity standard, but there's plenty of methods for measuring productivity. Productivity is always about having good data. If you don't have good data from before, measure good data now, meaning you need to know how many resources, what are the work hours, and what are the production quantities that they're producing. That's usually the hardest thing to get because the resources tend to get paid. You can get payroll data or equipment hour data, equipment rental information. Knowing what is produced on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis is more difficult. Often you only have production quantities on a month-to-month basis, and that can be weak data for trying to parse out a productivity analysis. But if that's the best data you have, monthly production, then use it. On a fixed price contract, you may have no production data at all. You got to find a source of production data to do a productivity analysis. It's very difficult without it. So if you haven't tracked it before, start tracking it now. We can share tons of guidance on COVID specific, but you've got delay issues, you've got productivity issues, and there have been and continue to be a lot of FEDIC specific guidance on COVID-19, common law specific guidance, and lots of presentations still ongoing around the world on COVID. So there's so much out there right now that I'll just leave the summary at that, and maybe we can provide some other references. Explain the difference between grouped period, blocked period, and bifurcation. Two different kinds of things here, grouped periods versus blocked periods. I don't know that I'm going to explain, grouped versus blocked here. I'd have to look at how we're parsing those words to give you something I call a definition. We could open up RP29 and really look at it, but blocking or grouping periods together is just about looking at delays perhaps over a 2-month period instead of a 1-month period. So, and why do I say month? If you have monthly updates, the normal way to do an MIP 3.4 analysis or an MIP 3.3 analysis, but the normal way to do an observational analysis or even a Windows implementation time impact analysis, MIP 3.7, is to go period to period, update at the beginning of the period, update at the end of the period. Frequently, not me frequently, but frequently, we see analysis that says, I'm not going to analyze update 20, update 21, and update 22. I'm going to talk about this whole period from update 20 to update 25 in its entirety together. Why are analysts doing that? Well, they might have a much more functional view of concurrency. They might have schedules that have a lot of inconsistencies in the details, but that have generally correct data overall in terms of what month things happened in. And it might be to their benefit to group things in larger time periods than to use every update. Looking at some of the challenges in the earlier questions from Srijesh, the bigger time period you look at, the more those problems either get solved or obscured. If they get solved in a rational way, it's a good thing. If they get obscured without getting solved, it's probably a bad thing. And these, to me, tend to be weaker analyses. This is why, like I say, I don't block or group periods a lot. I parse out all the details so that I understand them. Then when I present, I might summarize, because in my details, there are going to be a lot of things that are so minor or irrelevant that they're not worth the time of the arbitrators or anybody else to hear. However, I want to have those details for myself so that I know that my arguments are very well structured and supported by data and details. Bifurcation is something different. It goes the other direction. Bifurcation is actually splitting your analysis of progress and your analysis of logic changes so that you can develop that level of detail. So grouping or blocking periods much more reduces the detail in the analysis. Bifurcating almost always goes from one update to the very next update. And the split that is referred to in bifurcation, or the half-step analysis, is first analyzing all progress and then secondarily analyzing all logic changes between the two updates. What does that allow you to do, or maybe even force you to do? it allows you to identify all of the details in how the critical path changes over the course of that period. And then, as I said, if you want to do an analysis presentation that groups periods and talks about things like, in this 3-month period of the project, the critical path went through building 2 as opposed to through building 1. I'm fine with that, but be prepared for somebody to dig into the detail, which means, you know, somebody like me is going to say, okay, you're saying it goes through building 2. What activity in building 2? Is it mechanical work? Is it the structure of building 2? How did you determine that that is critical? Where does it tie back into the overall project, which is potentially a development? And if I think you're wrong, you know, I'm going to keep digging into those details until I can point out the idea that your analysis by grouping and summarizing things is obscuring the true critical path of the project, if that's in fact what you're doing. If, however, the critical path is actually in building 2 and it goes through a bunch of activities in building 2 that really aren't critical to the dispute, because one particular contractor clearly has responsibility for everything in building 2, and it doesn't make sense to talk about, you know, mechanical work on the 3rd floor in area 7 of building 2 because nobody cares, then I'm not going to ask those questions. I'm going to say, yeah, you know, he's presenting a reasonable analysis. We all know the critical path was in building 2 during this period of the project. And I appreciate the fact that he summarized and not, you know, dug into all the details, because we don't need to hear it. I hope he's done those details because I have, and that's why I'm agreeing with him, right? So that's grouping or blocking versus bifurcation. If there's some different definition behind grouping or blocking, we can dig through that. I hope if look at the RP 29, and if there's something between grouping and blocking that is confusing to you, I can open it up myself and parse out the different sentences, but I don't think there's any difference. It might be an inconsistent. I wish we'd use only one term, but to me, grouping and blocking, I think in all their uses in the RP, they probably mean the same thing, but I'd have to validate that myself by having the document in front of me. Due to resource turnaround, a new PM steps onto the project. I like all these case studies and examples. He decides to rework the schedule in its entirety. I hope he's a good PM. Okay, the way he sees fit, and a new baseline is assigned. How would the forensic schedule analyst proceed with evaluating the delay impact? Okay, so good question. New baseline, you know, is there a delay? He proceeds to rework the schedule in its entirety. I'm taking it that the new schedule is going to take longer to execute than the old schedule. If this person is a good project manager, maybe the reason the new schedule is taking longer than the old schedule is because the old schedule had some inappropriate assumptions, because it was missing scope, because it had other problems that aren't consistent with what's needed to execute the project. And that's certainly going to affect who's responsible for the delay. You know, whoever was responsible for putting together the unreasonable plan, in my argument, is responsible for whatever delay results from putting together the reasonable plan compared to the unreasonable plan, because the reasonable plan was what was always necessary. Read the 2020 paper, which you'll get, which kind of talks a lot about schedule error versus delay, and think about, you know, when somebody makes a schedule error, which, you know, my argument in that paper and here is that putting together an unreasonable plan and then saying, this is my plan, that's an error. But you have to effectively prove that it's an error when you're an analyst in order to throw out that unreasonable plan. In this case, you have a project manager who is throwing out, it sounds like, perhaps his own company's plan and saying this plan isn't reasonable. Maybe it's a subcontractor's plan. Maybe it's a contractor's plan and he's the owner. I don't know. But he's saying a plan is unreasonable and this is a new plan. If the new plan is in fact necessary, then whoever put together the unreasonable plan is probably responsible for the delay. If the new plan is his you know, own preference and isn't necessary, then maybe he's responsible for the delay. It comes down to, what does the contract require? I have a feeling, you know, by the way you're wording this question, he decides to rework the schedule in its entirety. Sounds a little negative to me. Maybe you don't agree with this reworking, but you know, it certainly depends on the circumstances of this project. But how would you evaluate it? Same way you would evaluate any other logic changes. And I think we will have time for an example here. I'm going to go through an example that talks about evaluating logic changes and things like that. So we can talk about this one a little bit, or we can go quicker to the example. You feel free to jump in if you want to talk a little bit more about your project. No requirement to do so, but if you'd like to talk a little bit more about your project, I'm happy to do that now or later. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this project already incurred delay in time when the new project manager stepped into this project. So there was COVID impact and some other series of impacts which contributed to it. He decided the issue with this particular project is not just the horizontal, it's horizontal and vertical construction and very complex. And how he viewed to manage the schedule for this project was a bit different. He tried to elevate one level up from how detailed the schedule previously was 100 pages versus maybe 25 that he proposed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's basically he abandoned the concept there, the scope is there, the same thing consistent with the contract, but how he decided to present to the government in this case as an owner, how he's going to construct or manage and continue tracking the progress became completely different.
And was there an actual difference in delay between the two schedules, or were they fairly similar in terms of the amount of time?
They were similar.
Mm-hmm.
He may be delayed by only a couple of weeks from what he saw from the original delay. He did add a few more days to how he would see feasible to complete. And he did make an effort to expedite as much as possible, to stay on top of subcontractor to perform. Mm-hmm. But for the forensic analysis purposes, how would you just basically abandon one schedule mm-hmm. and rework the entire schedule? Let's say instead of doing floor by floor, he was doing in blocks of phases and areas.
Yeah, I think that's okay. We've talked about this idea of rebaselining a little bit. I would say that during the first portion of the project, the schedule that was being used to manage the project is this more detailed schedule, and that's the one you want to analyze. And then a new PM comes in and produces a higher level, less detailed schedule and replaces the earlier one. After that, going forward, it sounds like he has the authority to do that. He's the PM. If that schedule, the new one, then continues to get updated, and that one is being used to manage the project, that's the one you want to analyze. So I absolutely think that you should analyze the schedule that is being used to manage the project, because as I said, a lot of delay analysis does ultimately come down to what people knew, what are the decisions they're making, and what's the basis for those decisions. How do you do the transition associated with the rebaseline? Just like, again, the way you would analyze any other schedule revision, small or large. So this is why, what I try to give people is a consistent, reasonable, objective basis for everything that they're doing. So I am going to analyze the tiniest change to a schedule on the same logical framework that I'm going to analyze a wholesale replacement of the entire schedule. They're two very different things, but my reasoning is very similar. The new PM comes in, changes the whole schedule. Okay, what am I going to do? We can call it a rebaseline if you like. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. I'm going to compare that new schedule to the old schedule. What was the critical path in the old schedule? And maybe it went through the horizontal work. What's the critical path in the new schedule? Maybe it goes through vertical construction in building 2. Maybe it goes through engineering, but something different. I'm going to analyze both paths, state this was the path in the old schedule, this is why it was the path, this is whether it was consistent or inconsistent with what the parties were actually doing at the time, this is the new path, this is the PM who changed it, this is why he changed it, and after that they started executing this project. Ask yourself, was the old schedule consistent with what was being executed at the time? If the answer is yes, that's fine. All you did is justify the fact of why you should be analyzing the old schedule for the prior period. The new schedule, is the new schedule consistent with what the parties are actually doing in the real world in the project? If the answer is yes, then you should be analyzing the new schedule for the new period. The only piece that is really going to matter in your analysis, because everything is going to come out at the end of the project, in theory, the project will someday be completed, and it will either be completed early, late, or on time. So at the end of the project, you're going to have your answer for how many days of delay did this project experience. All you're doing in the analysis is parsing that answer to say effectively when, why, what underlying activity delays caused this overall net project delay. Were there savings? Sometimes delay, sometimes savings, and in the end, my net is not the sum of just all the delays, but the sum of all the critical delays less the savings associated with.
Cannot hear you. Pause, please.
The old schedule showed the project was a month late. The new schedule shows that the project is a month and a week late. That's the difference, a week, right? So you can explain all the changes, explain the underlying reasons, explain the difference in the two critical paths, but ultimately you have the answer. The amount of delay that was caused, when I'll put it in quotes, by replacing the schedule is 1 week, if you accept my numbers in the underlying example. And then you explain why. If the new schedule is reasonable, then it's reasonable to say that the delay is 1 week. If the new schedule was unreasonable, let's say the project couldn't be executed a month and a week late, but in fact would take 3 months. Again, that's going to come out at the end of your analysis, because at the end of the project is going to actually be completed 3 months late. And you're going to explain as you go through your analysis why the project wasn't completed a week and a month late, but 3 months late. So you're going to explain all those things as you parse through the new schedule. And that'll really help you, because while you need to make a decision on the front end as to whether the new schedule is reasonable and whether or not you should be analyzing it, ultimately, if the new schedule is not reasonable, the real world will happen and it'll prove for you that the new schedule was perhaps unreasonable. The challenge for you as an analyst is that you're using the schedule to say, this is what was critical. And if the new schedule is unreasonable, then the basis for saying that things are critical is very questionable. But that's why you parse, the reasonability each day, each week, each month, so that if there's a major deviation, like on Tregis's project, between what the schedule is showing and what's going on in the real world, you're going to explain that with contemporaneous information from that month, right?
Yeah.
So I'm giving you a lot there. I tend to talk on these things because, I don't know anything about these projects. So I give very broad and answers that could take in a lot of different directions. You know the details of the project. You're going to have to say, oh, I heard something that allows me to pick, this is what I want to do,
No, it's very helpful. Thank you so much. If I may, I typed in the chat related to Sriji's also the question, if the schedule has broken links and instead the dates are forced by the constraint, would the schedule be still viable for the analysis?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the nature, certainly, of the link. So, let me speak broadly this way, that these 10,000 activity schedules, that it looks like both you and Shrija tend to deal with these very large schedules. My view on very large schedules in general is the ones that I see tend to be bad. Even on very, very complex projects, let's say you have 30,000 activities, even 10,000 activities. 10,000 activities is a lot to manage for one person. You can have one good person and they can do it. sometimes you have 2 or 3 people that are touching the schedule. Schedules are delicate. This is a challenge with CPM schedules that maybe we don't talk about enough. Primavera, Microsoft Project, even Power Project, and some of these other software out there. Some of them are better than others. Primavera actually, you know, I will say this, it's omnipresent in construction, so we have to use it, but it's not good software, in my opinion. It's not very good software. You need talented users when software is a little bit weak. The ability to introduce what I would regard as errors in a piece of software like Primavera is very, very high. So if you have 3 users touching a schedule because it has 30,000 activities in it, they all need to be very good because any one of them could break it. You need to be doing quality reviews frequently. You need to be doing delay analysis every update. You know, if you're putting that much effort into building a 10,000 activity model, you should put just as much effort into maintaining it and making sure that it's tied to the real world. Look at Srijus's example, where he has a critical path that isn't consistent with the real world. And maybe he has a 10,000 activity schedule. Let me ask you this. Why is somebody putting in the effort to build a 10,000 activity model that shows us something that is very different from what's going on in the real world? When I get a large schedule, and I'll give you another basis, I do the same thing. If I get a 100 activity schedule or a 10,000 activity schedule, I do the same things. Is number one, I run an open ends check, because if the schedule has open ends, I already know that I am dealing with somebody who's weak. To me, it's axiomatic to critical path method that a schedule cannot have open ends. And I'm very firm on that. Why? Because the purpose of the critical path method is to identify the critical path from the start of a network, or today, to the end of the network. If a schedule has open ends, then it's like a maze with more than one end. And the critical path method does not work, because for the critical path method to work, there can be only one end of the network. Some schedulers will say it's okay to have open ends because there's no successor on the project. I don't need to tie this to anything. And the software will work anyway, and it's not that important. I have a firm view of this. They're wrong. And it's not because it can't work at all the way they're doing things. It's because if you're willing to accept yourself from the most basic rule of constructing a CPM network, then you are probably not a very good scheduler to begin with. And I have never seen a scheduler who liberally allows open ends to their schedule that also does a very good job of modeling the real world. Because I don't know, I've never seen it. They don't follow CPM processes well, and they also just don't model the real world very well. I regard it as a type of engineering in that people that don't know the basics don't tend to be able to engineer very complex things to a high level of quality. So no open ends, period. I do an open ends check the very first time. The second thing I do is look at the critical path. And if the critical path has no basis in reality, I immediately know I have a problem. So here on your project, you're saying, you know, it's affected by open ends. You know, that to me is something, I don't even continue with the analysis necessarily. If they're minor and not related to the critical path, I'll still analyze the schedule, but I will talk to the scheduler on the project and say, all these open ends need to be closed. And I'm very nice about it. You know, I'm not being firm here. I'm kind of trying to go into teacher mode a little bit, but you know, when I'm dealing with project parties, you know, again, it's their schedule. I'm not telling them what to do. What I tell them is, I want to help you. If you allow your schedule to have these open ends, you might miss something when something becomes critical. I want you to tie these off, because that way the schedule is going to help you identify when things become critical. If you let this schedule be messy, it won't tell you things. And now I'll give you another kind of a bullet point that you can use in terms of a conclusion. when do you know that you have a good, useful schedule? You put a lot of time into building a 10,000 activity model. It's record keeping for the project. It shows people the plan. You can use it for communication. That's great. But you've put a lot of effort into building a computer model. Why? You have a good schedule when your schedule tells you something that you didn't already know. And that's a great feeling. Sometimes you'll update your schedule and you'll think your project is perfectly on track, and a path will come up, and it'll be, I don't know, procurement of the unit heaters for the 3rd floor. And it'll come up as critical or as a delay. And you'll say, oh, I missed something. I made a mistake. That's not critical. And then you'll have a realization, and you'll say to yourself, wait a minute. Oh, I need those unit heaters before we can begin plastering on the 3rd floor. Oh no, where are they? Nobody ordered them. I got a problem. And you just identified a real world problem based on the model that you built. And then you tell somebody about it and they do something about it. That's when you have a good schedule. And that's the idea of the critical path method. So, you know, I went on a little bit of a spiel there, but tie off all your open ends, because you never know when something's going to pop up that you didn't realize might become critical, but things get delayed. And when your schedule tells you something that you didn't already know, then you're really contributing a lot of value to the project, right? It doesn't happen often because, you know, most people have their eyes open in the real world, but when the schedule tells you something that you didn't already see, it's a great feeling. So, I don't know if that's an answer, more of a spiel, but. All right. These are similar questions about 10,000 activity schedules. And there's an as-built model for all activities, but it would be, well, yes.
Sorry, before to go into the next question, we have some about from our followers in YouTube channel. We can provide a short answer before to go into the next one, please.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'm gonna let you know. From Suleiman from Egypt, what is your opinion about accuracies for TIA at end of the project?
A TIA at the end of the project, my opinion about what? Accuracy. What is my opinion on accuracy of TIA at the end of the project? You know, general question. So I think I spoke about this in one of the earlier schedules. Building additive models at the end of a project is not my favorite way to analyze schedules. Why? Because at the end of the project, we already know what happened. And I think that the best approach as a forensic schedule analysis is to do what we call an observational dynamic analysis. Why? How do we measure delay? We measure delay by comparing what the plan was to what happened in the real world. There's another thing that is very important to consider, in that people don't think about what we're measuring when we measure delay. It gets a little esoteric and conceptual again, but there's only one, you know, reality. When we're measuring delay, we're always measuring reality against a hypothetical, right? When we're doing fragment insertions into a schedule, what we're doing is saying, I am going to add some scope, or I am going to add some activities. I'm going to change the plan for the future to see how it affects my plan. And during the project, if you get a change order, you build a fragment for the new scope, you put it into your schedule and you say, this is how it's going to affect my plan. And that's very, very valid. To do it at the end of the project, and people do it a lot still to this day, but to do it at the end of the project is a very different thing. Now, what you're doing is saying, I'm going to build a model to show you how this addition of scope affected my plan. Why don't I like that approach? Because I already know if the project is completed, I already know how your plan was affected because reality has happened. What I need to do now is go back and explain why it was affected. And I don't need to do additive modeling to do that. What I do with additive modeling is potentially show this new activity affected that new activity, and it can be very useful when not all the scope was incorporated in the schedule, because otherwise your schedule just has these blank spaces potentially, and it's hard for people to understand. But it's not necessary, because the project is done and we already know what happened. It's not necessary to build a model of what actually happened, because we know what actually happened. So I'm generally against it, but it ties also very specifically into Srijas's next question here, which kind of talks about, okay, you know what happened, but there's 10,000 things that happened, and it would be very time consuming to build a model. Certainly, in some cases, people do an additive model, very simple, you know, maybe build a 100 activity model to try and model, you know, 1,000 things that are happening. Again, for a lot of reasons. Sometimes those models are good. Sometimes they're very bad because they exclude critical details, and sometimes they do so intentionally. So in general, not a fan of additive modeling after the fact. I am a fan of additive modeling during the project to incorporate scope that is new. Absolutely, that's the way to do it. After the fact, I'll do it if I'm required by contract. I'll do it if there's scope missing that's going to confuse people because it wasn't in the schedule. But in general, I'm against it. It is much harder to build a model that is consistent with the real world than to simply look at the real world when you already know what happened. You know, look at sources of real data. So that's my guidance. I'll do it, but only if an observational dynamic approach is not possible. Would I do additive modeling, or if I'm required to do it by contract? And I wish people wouldn't put it into contracts, because it is not the best approach to perform forensic schedule analysis, period. And I understand it's very popular still in many parts of the world. Going forward, you're going to see it diminish, because we have a lot of smart people working in this field, and there are better approaches. But it might take another 20 years, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks, Marge. We can continue with the question number 6.
Okay, so I'm going to go through the rest of these questions, and I'm going to leave, I hope, here a half an hour to show you some examples, maybe have some more discussion. I think the example will be interesting. Okay, so the 10,000 activity schedule, you know, where it's going to take a long time to build an as-built model. What's the best way to develop a reasonably accurate model without having to spend too much effort? Focus on a number of high-order float paths. Yes, I mean, if there are paths with, you know, you have a 10,000 activity schedule, but there are many paths with hundreds of days of float, you know, they could safely be ignored. In general, the more things you ignore, the higher risk you're taking, right? So if you were to analyze every activity of 10,000, that's your lowest risk approach, but it's also your most time consuming. If you were to analyze only one critical path, that's the least time consuming from an analytical perspective, but it's the highest risk, because you're increasing the possibility that you're going to miss something. If you have a 10,000 activity schedule and you actually have all the updates, then you know, I'm not sure you need to build an as-built model, because you have it. The last update is your as-built model. Whether or not it's a good as-built model is another question, but you don't need to build it. So very dependent on what information you have. I don't think, you know, you need to build 10,000 activity as-built models. I do think you can focus only on near critical paths, but always be mindful that what is critical can change over time. In general, in any given month, I'll give you a safe, you know, without, you know, focusing only on the critical path and without including every single activity in the schedule, a safe bet is usually to analyze everything in any given month that has a float that is equal to or less than the number of available work days in that month. So if you're working like a 5-day work week, there's usually 22 work days available in a month. Analyze anything that's scheduled to take place in that month and has less than 22 days afloat. If you want to use 20 as a general guidance, that's fine. Anything less than 20 days afloat, you can do a filter for everything that has 20 days afloat or less and just analyze that. Be aware that calendar effects could come into play though. You might have an activity that looks like it has 60 days afloat, but you know, it's got a successor that maybe has, you know, much less due to calendar issues, and that 60 days afloat could disappear 1 week. So like I say, there's risks to excluding anything. Some people will call near critical 10 work days or less. Yeah, that's usually safe. It's a lot less safe than using 20 because there tends to be 20 available work days in a month. And if you have a path that has 10 days afloat and is scheduled to begin in a particular month and does not begin, then by the middle of the month, it will become critical if the other paths all make as planned progress, right? If you can picture that in your head. So 10 days afloat is going to disappear over the course of 2 weeks. And if you're not going to pay attention to that path in a month, you might miss it when it becomes critical. If a path has 25 days afloat and doesn't make any progress, then at the end of the month, it's going to be near critical. And when you do your filter for 22 days afloat or less, you're going to see, oh, this path has 3 days afloat, and you're going to catch it. You're not going to miss it. If you want to be a little bit more conservative even than that, you have a 10,000 activity schedule. Start doing filters and see how many activities are left. Look at everything that has less than 50 days afloat. And if you still have 10,000 activities, look at everything that has less than 40, less than 30. And if you say, well, in order to get this schedule down to a reasonable level of something I can even see and understand on my screen, I got to use 10. Okay, filter it down to 10 days afloat, but then be aware you're taking a risk and go back and do another quick review and say, was there anything that had 15 days afloat, but didn't make any progress at all during my period? And if there were no other delays, I got to go back and rerun this analysis. I would say start, you don't just go down to 10, start at 50, 40, 30, 20, and you're probably generally safe around 20. If you want to go farther than that, that's up to you. Truth is, most things with even 10 days afloat don't become critical on projects that are experiencing delay, because the critical path itself is not making as planned progress. So in the course of a 20 workday month, the critical path might only make 10 days of progress, which means you get another 10 days of delay on the critical path, and that other path that had even a little bit of float is still not driving. But you really got to parse to figure out where the delays are. Anything you do, I want to make your lives easier, and there's starting to be some good software out there now too, but I want you to understand how to do the analysis before you start applying the software. But there's some good products starting to come out on the market that'll analyze 10,000 activities very quickly. I warn you, if you have not been hands-on doing an analysis, and this is what I don't like about the software side, the software will give you an answer, no question. But you need a person to know whether or not the answer is right or has any meaning in the real world. To go back to Srijit's example, the software is going to tell you that it's the shop drawings that are delaying the project. If you don't understand scheduling and you don't understand schedule analysis and you give that answer to someone, you're going to look foolish because it has no bearing on the real world, and they're going to consider you a computer jockey, which you don't want. Understand how to do the analysis yourself, and then you can run the software. And when you get nonsensical answers from the software, you'll be able to recognize it. What is the reasoning behind collapsing the schedule from end to start in MIP 3.8 and 3.9, particularly for 3.9? If the windows are addressed from start to end, will it not be better address the already granted extensions of time? It's a good question in terms of sequence. I don't think this is firmly answered, but in RP29, we definitely give the answer that if you're collapsing things, you should go from back to start. Why? Well, the whole idea of collapsed as built is the but for question. So you start taking things out of the schedule and asking yourself, would the schedule have completed earlier but for this delay? I don't like this argument at all. I don't think it has any firm or good underlying theoretical basis, but it's compelling in a lot of cases. Just because it's compelling doesn't mean it's right. There's plenty of analytical techniques that'll give you an answer that seems to make sense, but if they're based on a flawed theory, it's not going to be useful in any kind of a way to understand what's actually happening on the project. Why do we start at the back and go to the front? Well, because we're answering the question that we're asking in terms of doing a but-for analysis. So the last delay on the project, you remove it and you say, without this last delay, the project would have finished a week earlier. And then you keep going backward in time to say, if I remove all these delays, what's the earliest the project could have been completed. If you were to start at the front of the project and remove the very first delay, you might not get any effect because all you're going to get is critical path shifts through the network. And it's kind of it would be a very strange way to answer the but-for question in the analysis to start at the front. I already don't like the underlying theoretical basis for the but-for analysis, but I would agree that if you're going to do a but-for analysis, it seems to make more sense to start at the end. If you start at the front, I'm not even sure I could really follow the logic of what you're trying to conclude. I think you're trying to say there are extensions of time being granted and they go chronologically forward in time. True, but granting an extension of time doesn't really have any effect, at least not directly, on whether on when things take place. It more has an effect of moving the goalpost in terms of liquidated damages and things like that. In theory, people might change what they actually do, and I do think this happens, so it's more than just a theory, but people might change what they actually do based on whether or not a time extension is granted. And I think that's an important consideration, and I think it's an important consideration that undermines the theoretical basis for even doing a collapsed as-built analysis, because collapsed as-built analysis has a very hard time and usually ignores the fact that the decisions that were made were a result of the knowledge that people had at the time. Look at the 2020 paper, and I think there's a good example in there of the flaws with collapsed as-built theory to begin with. Read the Trauner book that I recommend. I think there's some good arguments against collapsed as-built theory in that book in general. Would it make more sense to start at the beginning? No. Does the theory make sense if you really dig into the details? No. So to me, I am more and more over time, I have not been a proponent of collapsed as-built techniques for 20 years. I would tell you if I was starting to become convinced that it was a good approach. I am not. I'm actually moving farther away from being convinced that there's any good theoretical basis for collapsed as-built analysis, which is not to say you can produce a very compelling presentation and argument on with a collapsed as-built approach. However, I think the underlying theory is wrong when it comes to complex infrastructure projects. And read the 2020 paper, and I hope you can understand my reasoning behind that. Force majeure modeling, how could a delay analysis? Yes, yes.
Yeah, please. So before to go into the question number 8, Vishnu, do you have comments about question number 6 and 7 is regarding to your comments?
Hi, I have on question 6. I don't have any. I don't have anything. On question 7, the reasoning behind extension of time, apart from just changing the goalpost in terms of the liquidated damages, my concern was like certain items which suppose there are some final fix items that are required only by the end of the project. Those things can be delayed. Sort of a pacing can be done for those items once the goalpost has been shifted officially. So it will not be any more considered as a delay in itself. Otherwise, there can be an argument unless, otherwise then I'll have to sit and prove that it is a pacing delay. I mean, it was a pacing done by me too, because the already got shifted because of some other delay. That's again, I will have to get into providing the sufficient information in terms of my notices to establish that I was just pacing my activity. And right. But once an EOT has been established, then it's a clear change in the goalpost for me. So anything that is done before that will not be even considered as a delay. So that was the reason I said if you start analyzing from start to end, so this extensions of time will come in picture in between somewhere. So many arguments related to some of the items which are not really critical can be avoided whether.
I think you can acknowledge the time extension regardless of the fact that, when you say start the collapsed as-built analysis, to me, starting the analysis means extracting the delays. And that, I think, is better done from the end to the front. However, something like acknowledging a time extension, you can acknowledge the time extension at the very beginning of the analysis. I'd really have to look into the details of how you're doing the collapsed as built analysis. Is this something you're doing or something somebody else is doing?
No, actually, I don't do collapsed as built. I'm new to, to me, it looks very subjective, and I have never done it practically for any of my projects. I just, when I read the theory, I felt this doubt, so I was asking this.
Yeah. I mean, so one thing that collapsed as built does not have a basis for, one among many things, is the sequence in which you should collapse things. Now, there are certain writers, and I'll share, I mean, I'll tell you directly that I reference in this presentation a number of papers by Andrew Avalon, who I have a lot of respect for. He has very well thought out presentations, and I do believe he does a lot of collapsed as built analysis and has presented on it many times. He has created a number of objective rules on how to do the analysis, basically saying, these are the rules I follow. Most people who do collapsed as built analysis do it very subjectively. What they're trying to do is present to you an analysis that supports their position. And if their position were different, they would present a different analysis. What I'm trying to give you is an objective approach to analysis that if I told you that there's a project between party A and party B, and you work for party A or you work for party B, you should give me the same answer either way by applying these techniques, because it doesn't matter who you work for. What matters is what is the difference between the plan and reality. Most, if not all, of the collapsed as built analyses that I have seen have been very biased, and even to the point of I don't think that the results of the analysis had much bearing at all in the real world on what was actually delaying the project. So people can do it well, I believe. I think most of the people who are doing collapsed as built analysis are not doing good analysis at all. And even to do it well, I think the underlying theory has tons of problems, which if you want a good book that has a very short presentation on problems with collapsed as built analysis, which calls it at the time just the but-for scheduling argument, the Trauner 1990 book, which is 30 years old, will tell you why collapsed as built analysis is not a good approach. And I still think that Ted Trauner was right in 1990, 30 years ago. He was right that this is not a good analysis technique. So,
thanks. That pretty much clears. Thanks.
No problem. So,
okay, thanks so much. So we would like to let to Rana Finiano that has a case related to the topics that you have explained, Mark. So Rana, can you ask please your case?
Okay, it is about the huge baseline. It is what it is. I have around 30,000 activities baseline. It is a huge project, but this is the practice in UAE. Like we cannot accept any duration for an activity for more than 15 days, which resulted always in a huge baseline. Mm-hmm. And as you know, and I checked the baseline, there was no open and it was fine, the baseline, but it was really very hectic to review the updates every week. Mm-hmm. However, what happened, you know, that we will come to a point in such a baseline where the baseline does not really reflect what is going on site. So it will start showing a really delay. So the contractor suggested like another program as a working program, a construction working program, then another one. And the problem with this program is that their completion date does not match the contractual date. So when the contractor came to claim, he started using the rev that is not with the contractual completion date. Mm-hmm. So what I am doing, it's getting very messy. I cannot ask them to go back to Rev 10 because it's the approved one, because there is a lot of illogical thing. So what I asked them to do, to use the most logic program after checking it and after I'm sure that everything they have updated is right. And I'm taking the days of the delays regardless the completion date, and I'm adding it to the contractual completion date. You got my point? I'm not sure if this is the right practice, but in this, I don't know if you have a better practice to ask the contractor to do.
It sounds like you're taking a very reasonable approach, which I like already. I mean, you have a complex project and you have a complex problem here, but you're being reasonable about it and you're trying to work with the contractor. So that already is good. You know, I think you got to start with, you know, what do I want to achieve here? It sounds like what you want to achieve.
Exactly.
You want to have a model that really shows you what the current status of the project is and what the critical path is. And so does the contractor, I would hope, right?
Yeah.
So that's good. You're already both on the same page. You don't want to go back to a schedule that is 2 years old. I mean, that's not helpful to anybody. You want to look forward, right? You're in the middle of executing the project, and it's not going to be helpful to go backward. So I think taking your most recent schedule and trying to fix it, as you say, trying to make it in conformance with the contract is a good approach. I had in the 2020 paper, I did this so that I would remember it, and now I haven't thought about it since the summer. So let me see if I can remember my framework for what is a reasonable schedule. They are all words that begin with P, and I did this so that I could try and remember them, and there are 5. But a reasonable schedule is practical, permissible, I'm not going to remember all. Practical, permissible. My trick didn't work. I'm going to have to pull up the 2020 presentation. If I could only get 2, that's really bad, but it's because I've been in the middle of this discussion, and they'll come back to me as soon as it's over. Possible, physically possible. Permissible, though, the permissible point is contractually permissible. So a schedule is a model of a plan. If that plan is not contractually permissible, then that's not a reasonable plan. Practical means, do you have the resources to actually execute the plan? If you don't, then it's not a reasonable plan. Why would you plan something if you don't have the resources to execute it? Possible is really physically possible. It means like if you put together a CPM schedule, but it's physically impossible to execute, then it's not a reasonable plan. And yeah, I'll get
Mark here. It's not in line with the contract, with the contractual completion.
You're on the permissible. So exactly. I argue in 2020 that if the plan that the model shows is not permissible, then it's not a reasonable plan. My last 2, which I just remembered, are practiced. Practiced means you have to actually work to execute the plan. If you have a plan, but you're actually doing something else in the field, then you're not practicing your plan. It's not a reasonable plan because it doesn't show what you're really doing. And the last one is published. Published means shared. You have to give the plan to the people that are going to execute it. And then it's a reasonable plan. If you prepare a plan, but then you put it on a shelf and nobody reads it, it's not a reasonable plan because nobody's actually able to understand it. So it has to be published to the people on all the parties responsible for the contract. So practical, possible, permissible, published, and practiced. Practical, possible, permissible, published, and practiced. Those are the 5 things that I do think you need to have a reasonable plan. All right. And in your case, I think you could argue, hey, you really have done a schedule that has a lot of detail, but I can't accept it because it's not permitted by the contract. You align it with the contract, and then I'll accept it. What you don't want to do, and this is just one warning on that though, when a contractor is telling you that they are delayed, believe them. So one thing that owners do that I don't like is anytime an update shows delay, they say, this schedule shows that you're not going to complete this milestone on time. The contract says you have to complete it on time, therefore this schedule is rejected. Don't do that. It's a misinterpretation of, I think, any contract in the world. While the contract might require people to complete certain things by a certain date, the contract can't create reality, and it might be impossible to do so. If you enforce on a contractor the fact that all milestones in the schedule must always show on-time completion, The contractor might show you a schedule that does that, but he might be lying to you. And he's lying to you because you're telling him, I want you to lie to me. Do not do that. Tell him, I want you to tell me the truth. And then we're going to figure out together why that milestone has been delayed and whether or not we agree on the basis. But don't hide all the delays from me. All right. So when I say permissible, just take that caveat, as it's very important that you don't force contractors to never show you delay. That's a bad practice.
Okay.
All right. Very good questions.
All right. Thank you.
So there's I think only 2 more questions, which is great because on the last question especially, I want to get into this example. I'll give you, honestly, I just gave you a whole bunch of text. We should, I guess, share this presentation. I was going to edit the text to shorten it, but I think there's some good discussion to Danilo's questions here. Let's do the force majeure question, which is how do we model a force majeure event? A storm can be placed on a date, the effects of which can be established, but something like coronavirus, which we view as a pandemic, is it or is it not a force majeure? Truth is, it's not foreseeable to anybody. Can we place it as such? Can you please advise, how would you model something like this? I know this is something that modern day humanity hasn't experienced. Some employers and consultants are trying to play smart by placing the risk of the unknown on the contractor, who is like everybody else and has no clue what to do. You know, very valid this year. There's so many good presentations on this that I think consider a lot of contractual variety. You know, FEDIC has been doing a lot of presentations on this year. And many consultants around the world have been doing presentations on this. So I think it's been thoroughly covered. You just got to find that information. There's not a lot I can add. I've done 2 or 3 presentations on it myself that have been, you know, an hour or even panel discussions. What can I say to add to it? What is foreseeable? I like the word foreseeable in that normally when you assume risks in the contract, when you sign a contract, you won't be held responsible for things that aren't foreseeable. And I think there's general agreement that that this COVID impact was not foreseeable. I will say that foreseeable is a judgment call and in many cases a legal determination. But when we say that something is not foreseeable to anyone, certainly there were many scientists around the world that were highlighting the risks of a global pandemic from a bat-borne coronavirus. So people foresaw it as a risk. Now that risk has become reality. And the question we ask is, contractually, who was carrying the risk? And for the most part, our contracts might not speak to pandemic. Some of the contracts that do speak to pandemic have even resulted in arguments between what is an epidemic, what is a pandemic, and there are parties in this world who are having definitional arguments to try and shift that risk because they have a specific contract clause that says, for example, the owner is responsible for any delays associated with an epidemic. And there's an argument that the owner is making saying this is a pandemic, not an epidemic, so I'm not strictly responsible. So you can really get to a ridiculous level of discussion on some of this stuff. Certainly a lot of owners are trying to shift as much risk to contractors, even though the contractors have no ability to carry that risk. I agree with that. Be careful the contracts that you sign. Are they trying to be smart by doing that? There are certainly plenty of consultants, plenty of attorneys in this world that try to help their clients by shifting risks to other parties. In a lot of cases, they are helping their clients, but to shift risk to a party who has no ability to bear it does not necessarily help your client because you increase the chances of project failure in general. And this is what we say in risk management. We say that risks should generally be borne by the party that has the greatest ability to manage them. In fact, my sense of what happens in the real world is risks are shifted to the party in the weaker negotiating position, not to the party that has a better ability to manage them. That is because our project management in the practices in the world are not perfect, and because markets don't generally tell people to manage projects well, they tell people to maximize profits and shift as much risk as possible to the other party. Contractors are generally in a weaker negotiating position because they need work to stay in business because they're contractors. That's the real world. What can you do? I think certainly you can try to get something treated like a force majeure, which is good in some places. It's bad in other places because you still have to execute the project and you don't get paid any more money. It's very dependent. Certainly you can make the argument that you have no better ability to manage the risk. And I think if you're working in particular for a government, you should argue that going forward, that even on this project, that the risk was unforeseeable, and therefore, even if you had the risk, if it's unforeseeable, there's no way you could have known you were assuming that risk when you were signing the contract. It was unforeseeable, and you should be relieved of the risk. In other contracts going forward, and this is, I'll argue, particularly working for government, you should certainly say that, you know, and you can lobby for this, you can lobby your governments for this in addition to direct contract negotiations. Tell them that the government has a much better ability to manage this type of risk than individual contractors do. And I think that's a reasonable argument. Will the government agree with you? I don't know. There's a recent case here in the US on a Board of Contract Appeals on a contractor that was working for the State Department, the US State Department in Africa, at a time when the site was impacted by Ebola. And the contractor argued that it should have been paid its costs to demobilize and remobilize and, you know, all of the costs associated with the delay. The contractor appealed it up to the Board of Contract Appeals here in the United States and was given the time. The contractor got no money and had to pay, in this case, for the additional costs of demobilizing and remobilizing. And I don't necessarily think that that decision is the right decision in that case or in any case, but the decision had a firm basis. I just don't like it because the contractor had no ability to manage the risk of Ebola, and the fact that the contractor ended up having to pay for it, I'm not sure was a just result. But the government's argument was, in this case, the US government had no ability to manage that risk either, and that under the terms of the contract, it was the contractor who had absorbed these risks. And in actual execution, it was the contractor who had decided to demobilize as a result of the risk. It wasn't the government who had told the contractor, you need to demobilize. So contractor ended up getting no money. That is the result in most force majeure cases in the US, not in all of them. Every contract's different, but that's usually the result. Is it a just result? You know, we can have different opinions on that. How would things go under your contract or any particular contract? Regardless of what the language is in the contract, I think these things are very hard to predict on who bears risk for an unforeseeable event. In theory, you know, I think a lot of ways, if something is truly unforeseeable, when the contract is executed, no one has assumed the risk because it's completely unforeseeable. And the truth is, if you put into your contract, I bear the risk for epidemic or I bear the risk for pandemic, it's foreseeable. You put language in the contract, right? But if your contract doesn't address it at all and it's unforeseeable, there is no ability to allocate risk for unforeseeable events. If you have language that says, I hereby assume the risk for all unforeseeable events, that might not even be enforced in some jurisdictions because you can't absorb things that you acknowledge you have no concept of. But who knows, in other areas it might be enforced. What are you to do? Well, you need to sign contracts, I assume, if you're a contractor, and owners can try to shift as much risk as they want to their contractors. I would protect myself with insurance. I would try to negotiate the detailed language of the risks with the owner, and I would try to lobby in the event that the owners have professional organizations, in the event that they have, in the event that they're government owners. I would try to lobby for better contract terms based on the argument that they're ultimately paying, by shifting all this risk to contractors, they're ultimately paying through the risk through inflated prices. Why don't you make an argument and say, you know, if you were to change this contract language, I would be able to reduce my price. The owners need to see, if you're trying to get them to change language, they need to see some savings. So try and negotiate that way. I don't know. There's a lot of ways to do it, but it's a tough, nobody wants this risk. So it's a tough one. But if you want another party to assume the risk, try and shift it to an insurance company. They're in the business of insuring risk, right? If you can't do that, try and negotiate the language. But I think if you're trying to negotiate, you need to offer something. And usually what an owner is going to want to see is some cost savings. So try and show them some cost savings, and maybe they'll change the contract language. On your current projects, all this stuff can be negotiated, and we've done a number of presentations this year on how to do that as well. All right, Danilo's comments on concurrency. I am not much time left here. We started about 6 minutes late, so we theoretically have maybe almost 20 minutes to discuss, maybe 15 minutes to show an example. I'm free to spend a little bit more time on it, but I don't want to hold everybody up all day. You know, talking about COVID, Danilo gave this case study. I give you a long written answer here, which I could maybe clean up a little bit, or we could just share it as written. I won't go through all this writing, but this is the same language that I shared with Danilo directly in response to his question. Instead of going through or reading all this language to you, which we can share, I thought I'd show you an example. So how's that sound? Here we go. I put this example together this morning. So I have not analyzed this project. It is completely unanalyzed, and I put it together so quickly that I can tell you that I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know what the result is of this analysis. But what I have here on the screen, and please let me know if you cannot see my P6 screen. I'm hoping everybody sees Primavera. So I've got a short little project in here. This is the baseline schedule, and I gave you 2 concurrent critical paths. I think my computer is going to be challenged running Primavera simultaneously with this video meeting, but we're going to do our best. I have this schedule running out through August, September, October, out to a substantial completion date in mid-October. And then I have a final completion date on this little project in early November, okay? So the project is about 2 months long. And there are 2 critical paths. So let's imagine, similar to some of these other examples we've had today, that there's area A and area B, or building A and building B. And they're each going to take about 2 months. And at the beginning of the project, they're concurrently critical, exactly concurrently critical, which is maybe unusual, but it's an example, right? And then I put together a little update. So I'll scroll down here because I have both schedules open, the schedule and the update. And here's what actually happened. You know, this is what we're going to have to parse. So there's a delay. Here's a substantial completion date now shown out as October 30th. And originally it was October 22nd, right? So we've got about a 1 week delay that happened during the period of September. You can see the progress. If I close the first schedule, you would see that in the second schedule, there's a new data date here on the Monday of the last week of September, which I think is September 28th, right? I think this is the Sunday, September 27th. So this is the progress we made during September in area A. This is the progress we made in area B. And you can see that both areas have been delayed. Area A has been delayed more than area B. What you might not be able to see as easily is that there are some significant logic changes in this schedule. You can see that these activities here, for example, activity A1010 and A1020, they actually happened concurrently to some extent. If we scroll back up to the baseline, here's A1010 and A1020, and you can see that they were scheduled sequentially. So in A and B, we had activities that were completely planned sequentially, and maybe this was a very reasonable plan. The project has 0 days afloat. Substantial completion is required on October 22nd, and final completion is required on November 5th. All right, but there's no float. Down here, here's the delay. There's your -6 work days in delay on a 5-day per week calendar. And down in area B, we're going to substantially complete area B on October 22nd on time. So although area B was delayed, which you can see here in this month, we've made some logic changes that have recovered that delay. How do we analyze this? You know, we've had questions of literal concurrency, functional concurrency. To me, we only have a 4-week period to look at here, the week of September. I don't see any reason why we can't, even if we have a functional concurrency view, why should we just say, well, both areas were delayed, area A was delayed more, there's a 6-day delay on the project, and it clearly happened in area A. why don't we start digging into the details and do the analysis, identify the underlying activity delays that resulted in the overall project delay, and then parse out responsibility. Maybe we have two different contractors. Maybe one is responsible for area A and the other is responsible for area B. And although area A has some serious delays, area B also has some serious delays, and maybe there's some concurrent delay. So, all right, let me, maybe I'll close them all, or I'll just hide this. I'm gonna hide the baseline a little bit so you don't have to look at it about that. Let me do that. See if I can hide one. All right, so I put the baseline at the top. We can just ignore it. And here's update 1, okay? And then I'm gonna do a step here. I'll put a copy of the baseline underneath update 1 if I have time to do that. So I'm gonna go to maintain baselines, and I'm gonna add one. I could save a copy of the current project as a baseline, but this is update 1. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna convert a copy of another project to a new baseline of the current project. Now, the other project is actually the baseline for this project. So that's what I wanna do. And here's my little list of projects here. I already made a copy. So when you do this, don't take your actual baseline and attach it as a baseline to your updates. Always make a copy of it. So I have a copy of my actual baseline that I'm going to attach as a baseline, so to speak, of this update 1. I do not like the way that Primavera uses the term baseline and that it's crept into the lexicon here in scheduling. A baseline is not an update to me. Baselines generally happen once, sometimes more than once, but the baseline is the plan from the beginning of the project that we measure ourselves against. If the plan needs to change, that's fine. That's not a new baseline. Plans are dynamic and they should change all the time. That's not a new baseline. The baseline is what we measure ourselves against. So if the plan is changing, that's okay, but we're always measuring back to a baseline. This is my preferred terminology, right? If we need to re-baseline, it doesn't mean we're changing the plan. It might mean we're changing the plan, but what it really means, what re-baseline means is we're changing what we're measuring against. We're changing the yardstick, and re-baselining should be done very infrequently, whereas revising the plan should probably happen almost all the time because plans are dynamic and we constantly are revising. One day it rains, the next day it doesn't. We change the plan every day. Whether we reflect those changes in our CPM schedule, some of them we reflect through logic changes, some of them we don't. But plans change, baselines shouldn't change very often. They only change when we need to change our basis for measurement. All right, so that said, that's a better use of the term baseline in my opinion. Primavera has decided, by mistake, I'll say it's a bad approach, but to use the term baseline to mean what we used to call a target schedule. But let's assign a quote unquote baseline, which I prefer the term target schedule. There's my copy of the baseline. I normally will make the first baseline, both the project baseline and the primary baseline, and then use secondary and tertiary baselines for other schedules. Often I'll use my prior update as the secondary baseline. In this case, I'm on update 1, so the original baseline is my prior update. But I'll usually use the same schedule here and here, only because even in my own mind, I want to avoid any confusion of terminology between the word project and the word primary. I usually make them the same schedule. I would really usually only make them different if I needed for some reason to attach 4 baselines, which I generally don't. And in a lot of software nowadays, I could attach many more than 4 baselines, but I really think that's unnecessary in 99% of cases. So now I have an attached baseline. What do I do with it? Let's show some bars, I guess. So we'll show the primary baseline bar. Let's show that. That's good. Now you can see the primary baseline bars. Oh, they're so small. I would make them bigger, but hopefully you can see them. You're tiny. I hate the way Primavera draws logic that now ties into baseline bars as a default. It makes things very confusing. Let's just get rid of the logic lines. Generally, I don't show logic lines because in a schedule of any kind of complexity, the logic goes all over the place anyway, and it's not valuable to look at it on the screen. So we'll show our little baseline bars, and now you can see, if you see these skinny yellow bars, you can see that the actual bars are much longer. There's a lot of delay in many cases. We can, it's good enough, I guess. I hate these skinny bars. Let's make a thicker bar. There you go. I'll give you thicker baseline bars because you probably couldn't see those skinny bars on a Zoom meeting. All right, so now you can see the actual versus the plan, and you can see some delays in both area A and area B. But let's start parsing a little bit. Another thing I'll do, and I'll show you this because I get a lot of questions here. What do you show on your screen when you're doing an analysis? So I then will add a few of these columns. It's good to add. You got to be very careful with this. I like to go back and look at the actual schedule itself, because I think similar to the way logic in a lot of these Primavera implementations shows badly on this screen, I never trust these columns. Getting the database to refresh display sometimes in Primavera can be buggy. It's buggy software to me. I like to look at 2 or 3 different things before I conclude that something's accurate. If I see something that I think is strange, I go back and I look at the original file to see if perhaps something strange is happening in the database, or I need to refresh my screen or something like that. So be careful with all these things. I'm going to put up baseline 1 finish and baseline 1 start, just so we have those things. Let's put them after total float in my current schedule. So put those things up. There's the project baseline and baseline 1, which you can see there. Probably good enough for now. Let's put, you know what? There's another nice thing to have up. Baseline 1 remaining duration. There it is. That's a good thing to have up. So it doesn't have to be the same thing for every analysis. Another thing that ties into Danilo's question, which we'll share, is showing times. In Primavera, now that Primavera is running all schedules on effectively a less than a minute time parsing, lots of your times will get misaligned. You can see in the schedule, I'm showing the time because every activity is starting at 8 a.m. and ending at 5 p.m. If you see time misalignments, you'll start to see some funny dates. Like if I take an activity here and report it at 5 minutes after the hour, it'll push the end of the activity into the next workday. That can create a lot of unnecessary confusion, and it's good to eliminate it if you can. So here's a good little strange thing that I would need to clean up is like baseline 1 remaining duration didn't populate here for some reason. I could hit F5 to try and get my screen to populate, but it's not coming up right now. I'm not going to worry about it. It's just FYI on things that sometimes don't show up on your screen, and why to be careful with Primavera. In assigned baselines, I clearly have this as the primary baseline, but probably because of the way I made the baseline, I might need to go back and refresh it to get this data to populate in the database. So let's just not worry about it, I guess, because baseline 1 remaining duration is not populating for some reason. So, all right, so let's look at this activity, and we see that in our baseline, it was an original duration. None of these I changed, so we don't need to worry about the fact that I couldn't show you that the remaining durations in the baseline were all the same, because I didn't change any of the original durations. But in the baseline, this had a 5-day activity, and now in our update, it's completely done. All right, it's got a 0-day remaining duration. So we know that it completed. In the next activity, it had a 7-day original duration, but in the baseline, it's still got 4 days left. So we know that it's not completed. How much progress did it make? Well, using the scheduled data, it made 3 days of progress, only because it's still in our current schedule has a 7-day duration. It has 4 days left, therefore it made 3 days of progress. That's important to understand because you could argue against that, but again, we need a mathematical approach to our analysis. So we do the analysis in a very mathematical, methodical way, and then we try to tie it to the real world. Somebody might argue, well, that activity doesn't really have 4 days left. It's got 8 days left, and that's not a reasonable remaining duration. Okay, but then that makes everything an opinion. It's okay to have an opinion, but do the analysis first, do the mathematical analysis, and then explain if you have a different opinion based on other data in the real world. Don't just throw out the mathematical analysis and not do it, because then all opinions are equal. In many cases, the mathematical analysis will be a good representation of the real world. And when it is, you should rely on it because it's a much better basis than just your opinion, right? And you get a lot of crazy opinions out there in disputes regarding schedule analysis. It's just better to base your opinion first on logic and secondly on an explanation of why logic differs from the real world. All right. What else about delays? So you can see this activity here. You know, there's no delay here, and I can go through, we're running out of time. I can parse this analysis a little bit more for you, but you know, here we can see that both of these activities, which were both critical and on the critical path at the same time at the start of the project, started to make progress, but both were delayed. Is there any concurrency? This is where it gets in a very detailed way into the functional versus critical. How would I parse this schedule, or I'm sorry, functional versus literal? How would I parse this schedule in a literal sense? Well, I would look at activity 1010 here and say, this activity made 3 days of progress during the period. When did it make that progress? If the activity was being worked on Monday, August 31st, Tuesday, September 1st, and Wednesday, September 2nd, I will by default attribute those 3 days of progress to those 3 days, as long as the activity was actively being worked. What are the other possible approaches? And I think these possible approaches are described in either session 6, which is the advanced concepts 1, or in session 7. I could attribute all progress on the back end, or I could average progress over time. Smart PM by default, which is a schedule analysis software, averages the progress over time. You know, averaging progress over time is kind of silly because, and it's not wrong, but I just think about what's most reasonable. You know, to take 3 days of progress and average it over a period of roughly 2 weeks is like taking a quarter or a third of a day of progress and applying it to each day. You know, if you have production quantities, you can make an argument for that, but activities don't really make progress on any kind of a consistent basis. You know, just because they make 3 days of progress over the course of 2 weeks doesn't mean that the production quantities weren't all on one particular day or a different day. So my default rule is if you reported progress and it's reasonably reported and you actively worked that activity, I tend to give credit for that progress on the front end of that activity. So progress first, delay second. If you reported 3 days of progress and you actually worked the activity and the progress was reasonably reported, I give you credit for it on the front end. It works out better for a lot of reasons in the analysis in the long run, I find. If there's a real close critical path and you need to parse and say, well, was the activity being worked on Tuesday? Was it being worked on Thursday? I encourage you to do that. But as a starting point, it's generally better to put the progress on the front end and then see what becomes critical once you've analyzed progress. So here we make 3 days of progress, and we make all that progress on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday in this analysis without me giving you any other information. So I'm not giving you daily reports. I'm only giving you 2 schedules, and I'm asking you to analyze them objectively. Down here, the activity that was concurrently critical, we made 5 days of progress during the period. So, oh, I'm sorry, I was pointing to the 7 here. So we made 5 days of progress on both of these. When did we make the progress? Here, you know, I'll give you the 5 days of progress on the front end of the activity. But then when the activity doesn't complete, you're going to start to experience a delay, right? So we know that this activity made 5 days of progress, but when did it make it? We can give you credit for 4 days of progress on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but we can't credit that 5th day of progress on Friday because the activity wasn't done on Friday. So we can't credit the last day of progress until the activity is actually completed. The reason we need to parse things this way is because we don't know what the status is of an activity other than at the beginning of a period or at the end of a period. If somebody gives us, though, a start date and a finish date, then we know the status of that activity both before it started and upon its finish. But we need a rule, and like I said, we could average or we could front load or back load, but we need a rule for saying, what was the remaining duration of this activity on Friday, September 4th? And the rule that I'll give you that I find to be, and I've tested other rules, but I do find this to be the most reasonable, is that because at the beginning of this period, we thought that this activity had a 5-day remaining duration, and because it wasn't finished on that Friday, the rule, the best rule for discussing when is it going to be finished is at any time after Friday, it might be finished until it actually is finished. So I would assume with no other information, every day that this activity doesn't complete, that it's going to complete on the next day. That's a big concept. Why would we do that? Because if we assume that on Friday that everybody knew it would take another week, then we're assuming something that maybe the parties knew, maybe they didn't know. What we know, because they published a schedule on August 31st, is that they thought this activity would take 5 days, and that's all we know. When they don't complete it in 5 days, but they need another day and another day and another day, we can safely assume that it was going to take at least one more day because it wasn't done. But we can't spontaneously assume that it was going to take another 6 days unless we have some informational basis. Often we do have some informational basis. So there are reported quantities, or there are daily reports, or there's something that would allow us to state a remaining duration that has some basis in the real world. But what I don't want to do is just analytically start assuming things without following some strict objective rules. So I'm giving you a rule you can follow, that once an activity starts overrunning its planned duration, always assume it has 1 day left. And then if you want to expand on that assumption by finding other data in the real world, you can do that. However, once it reaches its end date, you're going to take advantage of that actual end date. So, you know, all this is going to shake out in the analysis anyway as you move through the activity. So parsing down to the day, unless you have two critical paths that are very close to each other, often doesn't add any change to the analysis anyway. Last little thing I want to maybe present here, and if people do want to hear a little bit more, I would spend a little bit more time talking about this example. But the last thing I'll say is on logic changes. These two activities, as far as concurrency, are both going to delay the project until one is completed. Once the activity in area B finishes on September 9th, then the concurrent delay, which happens on Friday, not Saturday and Sunday because these are not work days, but Friday, and then is the Monday, September 9th? Let's see. No, the September 9th is a Wednesday. So that concurrent delay would happen on Friday, September 4th, because the activities didn't finish, Monday, September 7th, and September 8th. On September 9th, one of the activities is actually completed, and that's the activity in area B. So after that, it's no longer critical, it's done. But the activity in area delay, in area A, ends up being delayed another 2 days. So there's 2 days of delay that are purely associated with activity A. And the delay during this period before September 10th and 11th, that's the delay that's concurrent between areas A and B. And then you get 2 days of delay in area A. The other thing to consider here, though, is that there's another change. It would really complicate this thing more. Whether this is a logic change or not, I would analyze this as progress. So let's go to the next activity. This is out of sequence progress. And if you remember, all these activities were sequential. Here in area B, we had an activity that was supposed to start after 1000 here, B1000. It was supposed to start on September 10th, which is a work day. It actually started on September 7th, which is the Monday. So we got 3 days of progress on September 7th, 8th, and 9th that were concurrent with this in activity A. You could start analyzing that progress if you like on September 7th. Like I said, we can parse every single day of this project and say, you know, as soon as this path through area B made another day of progress on September 7th, but the path through area A did not make any progress, then area A actually became more critical than area B, because on September 7th, area B began making progress. And that's the day of your critical path shift. It's not much of a shift, but listen to this. Before September 7th, so on, that's a Monday, right? So forget September 6th or September 5th, because neither of these activities work those 2 days. On September 4th, the Friday, on September 4th, both areas were on the critical path. On September 7th, both areas were on the critical path at the start of the day. By the end of the day, area B had made a day of progress and area A had not. Now on the morning of September 8th, area A is solely critical. So your shift is from a concurrent critical path in areas A and B at the beginning of the project, where they both had the same length, to a path on the morning of September 8th, where area A is driving the project, and any delays in area A are going to delay the project. Area B on the morning of September 8th has dropped off the critical path and is no longer critical. That's the day of the critical path shift. So that's parsing for you, so that now when you get to the end of the schedule and say, well, I think area A caused the delay and I'm not sure area B did, I would say, well, they're both critical at the start of the period. If you're saying, well, the delay was in area A, why? By going back to that very week when they were both critical and looking in detail at what happened, you can identify the day of the critical path shift. And then you can look at daily reports, you can look at other things and say, is that a good decision? Does it reflect what was going on in reality? Already, I don't think a lot of people are going to disagree with you, because at the end of the period, it's pretty clear that area A took longer, right? But to do critical path analysis, you've got to explain when, why, and how. And by parsing these schedules, that's what you're doing. What about if I made a fragnet after the fact and I said, well, you know, I'm going to fill this gap here. You know, the reason this activity didn't take place is because I had some extra work I had to do in here. That's fine, but I don't really need to model that extra work to show the delay. The delay shows itself in the actual dates, and I can explain what was going on in this period of time based on a review of reality, daily reports, etc., without building a fragnet that ties these two activities together. If I build a fragnet that ties these two activities together, but I use dates that are different than the gap between them, why am I doing that? I'm creating a model that's actually showing something that is slightly different than what I know happened. And that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If you want to demonstrate that these dates are wrong, I would say don't demonstrate that by creating a model after the fact. Demonstrate it by comparing these dates to other contemporaneous project documentation. That's a much better, more objective basis for saying that the schedule is wrong than some model that you've created after the fact, which very often tend to be biased and at a minimum introduce an opportunity to introduce bias. So better to challenge dates based on other contemporaneous project documentation if you can. So that's a little bit of parsing, of concurrency, of logic changes. Like I said, on this piece here, it's looking at the successors. You can see it's interesting. The logic wasn't actually changed. It was just out of sequence progress. That's fine. Back here later in the schedule, you see these activities that are now sequential, that are now concurrent, that were previously shown to be sequential. That's a logic change. So, and this is frequent. Path B was also delayed, and in fact would be delayed as much as A. So if I go back here into path B and I restore, I guess I'll do this for you in this example. I restore the original logic between 1030 and 1040. That looks to be the only change, right? So let's take my start to start, finish to finish relationship and change it back to just a finish to start relationship. So this was the original sequential logic of area B. And I'm going to reschedule. Let's see if it probably won't let me reschedule to this data date with two projects open. Well, I'll take a second and reschedule it. I'm going to take a break and if people want to drop off, you can drop off. If you want to stay on, I'll show you a little bit more of some of the things that can happen with this analysis. But I want to first thank everybody for joining, and I appreciate all the very detailed and complex questions. I hope you gain something by this discussion of parsing, what to do, how to do it, and different ideas for how you can analyze schedules. There's a lot of detail here, and I want you to understand it, because if you end up buying a software package that does this analysis for you, this is the type of analysis that you want to do. And I want you to have an underlying basis to be able to ask the question, you know, when this software is crediting progress, how is it doing it? And understanding that there are different rules that might be applied, and different software packages might apply different rules. Software packages might not even tell you in the software documentation what rule they're applying when they credit progress. And you're going to have enough level of understanding to know, if you run a comparative analysis using a software package on a 10,000 activity schedule and it's giving you results, what rules is the software applying to produce those results? The packages that are out there, I can tell you, what they're doing right now, the new packages, is they're doing observational analysis, and they also are incorporating rules for doing dynamic observational analysis that does a bifurcated approach of analyzing progress and analyzing logic changes secondarily. So you'll be able to see all that in the packages that are coming out. But you will need to, as users, understand what is the basis for the software. I have talked with 2 companies that are developing this software to do what I can to try to both understand their basis for their rules and to offer them what I think is a proper basis for these schedule analysis rules, so that they can incorporate it into the packages. So I would just encourage you to have that level of understanding and not just rely on the computer. All right, so if anybody wants to jump off, please feel free. You know, Miley, if you want to thank everybody, like I said, I'll continue for another few minutes here. If people are really interested in this little example, I don't mind taking some questions on it, or showing a couple little tips and tricks related to schedule analysis if people want another 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Mark. So I think that our students are really interested in the topic that you are talking about. So if Danilo, do you have some comments about your case?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Well, in fact, Mark, thank you very much for this. I mean, but this is a new case. That was not precisely my case. My case is applying 3.4, where the baseline, which is the future update, is being moved, and now is earlier than the previous baseline, and now I don't have enough margin to manage the durations and make the 2 schedules match. That's the problem that I'm having, and that's a real case that I'm getting the new update. I mean, in a few days or hours, probably. You know, and that's why I sent you the
yeah, I can put that up on
snapshot.
I can put that up on the screen. Let's see. Let me see. Let me find your. Let me see if this comes up with your attachments. There.
That one.
I don't know if I need to open the. Let's see. We have an attachment. There you go. Get the attachment up. There we go. Just a little bit of detail here. It might be hard for people to see. I don't know how well you can see that on your screen if I zoom in. Maybe we could just look at the path here, because the details of what the activities actually are might not mean anything to people.
Yeah,
right?
it's meaningless. Yeah.
So you have this path of activities, and you're targeting it to a baseline here. So this is in red. This is your current update, and the yellow is what, the prior update?
No, the future update, or the next update, which
the
is
next update. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so somebody has made some schedule changes in the next update that has actually pulled this path back a little bit and recovered time.
Yeah, they move a lot of activities that were to be executed in the future and move them, you know, to like, let's say, to achieve an earlier completion, if we could say that.
All right, and so this is happening right now in this period, so August, September. What's the data date? So this information in yellow, your target schedule here. What's the data date of that update? Is it like the September 1st update?
Yeah, September.
Nominally?
I'm sorry, like August something, I believe.
Yeah, like late August.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have an activity here, the first one, that looks like maybe it was completed on time. So the little target bar is coming up. It started maybe a day late, but it actually finished on August 19th, right?
Yeah.
So completed on time. And then the next activity, again, maybe it started a little late, and maybe this is a real reported finish, completed on time. And then the next activity wasn't maybe scheduled to begin until September 1st as a successor, but the contractor or the person that submitted the schedule said, no, I got that activity also done on August 27th. That's fine. That's maybe a little out of sequence progress. It looks like just a little 1 or 2 day activity, right? So he's saying, no, I got that one done too. The next one was scheduled to be on September 3rd. He's saying, no, I started that one and maybe even got it done, or maybe I'll get it done September 1st. Next one as well. So he's making better than planned progress here by, similar to the example I was showing, maybe doing a couple little things in parallel that were planned to be sequential. That's what I would say
Exactly.
there. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah. In fact, I did those changes when I was doing the analysis, because this is my actual copy.
Okay. And then you have a couple more activities that, again, maybe it looks like they're going to happen sequentially in this update, but then in your next update were reported that no, they're going to happen in parallel, not sequentially, and that's going to save us some additional time. And you have one here that actually got pulled back before what looks like it was his predecessor. So somebody changed a link here. So we could say broke a link, changed a link, but it only dropped back a little bit. Maybe it dropped back to the data date, and maybe now it is an open end where it has no predecessor. I don't like that even in an update. I don't like it. People will say, well, it's fine. It can happen on the data date. It doesn't have any predecessors. I like, tie it to something, because again, if I run an open ends check and 100 activities come up, how do you know which one you left open just because it didn't matter to you, or which one you left open by accident? You really can't tell. So always tie off all your open ends no matter what. Even if you say, well, this activity, I'm going to execute it. I don't need to finish a predecessor. Go ahead and break the link, but then take that start and tie it back to something that was reasonable. If at the end of the day, there's no activity that could have started before project start, okay? So tie it to that, just so you don't have an open end, so we can still do open ends checks for schedule quality. Now, if this activity can start on the data date, fine, you've saved yourself some time. This is what contractors should be doing, is saying, oh, I'm being delayed and that's not good, but what can I do in parallel to maybe recover a couple days of delay? That sounds like it's a good thing. So the contractor has made some logic changes. Hopefully they're high quality logic changes with still ends tied off and everything else. The path in general seems to have kind of the same flow to it. And this is a kind of thing to look for. Look before analyzing maybe. So I don't have the P6 file for this. I can't analyze, but I can look. And I see, well, a lot of these activities, like look at the relationship between these two here, where they were going to happen in parallel. Looks like there's at least a start to start relationship. Here, it looks like we saved some time, but I still see the same relationship. And then all these look like they're finished to starts, and I see the same flow through these activities as I do on the other group. So it looks like you had some out of sequence progress that was planned sequential. It looks like you got a couple little logic changes in this zone. But by the time I get down to, let's say, here we have a little bit of parallel where it looks like it was sequential here as well. By the time I get down to this part of the schedule, it looks like all the logic changes were made up here in this zone, right? And the flow through this schedule is representing exactly the same flow as it was in the earlier schedule, just a little bit displaced in time because of these logic changes. So these are the logic changes you want to analyze. And it doesn't look like there are a ton of them. It looks like there's, maybe as many as 5 or 6, but they're small. And a logic change that shifts something by a day. Basically what you do is you take your schedule, you incorporate the little logic change, you try to match this path up. Once you've incorporated all these little logic changes, the red, what'll happen is the red will all drop back until every single red activity exactly aligns with yellow activity. And once you address the little changes in this zone, all these other activities are going to drop back and they're going to perfectly align with these yellow ones to the point that you're going to be able to say, I have addressed and analyzed every single little logic change. You're saying one other thing though. You're saying there's not enough something in the schedule.
A duration margin to adjust the. Yeah, because when we were doing 3.4, basically we are taking the duration and extending it to match the baseline, you know, so when they are, then we do run F9 and see the changes at the, you know, at the bottom of the project completion milestone, etc. But in this case, I don't have enough margin because the margin is actually negative. So I have to reduce it to negative durations if that were possible to match the target schedule, because the target schedule, which is the next month, has been artificially moved to occur before the critical path in the previous month. So that is the case in here.
When you say it's been artificially moved before, do you mean the data date of the subsequent update is earlier than the data date of the prior update?
No, I'm sorry. The one that is in little yellow there, the target schedule, is the August schedule, while the red one is the July schedule.
Right.
Okay. So basically what they did is they moved all these activities in yellow and moved the whole chunk of activities to occur in a much earlier date. So,
well, you say much earlier, it looks like a little bit earlier.
Yeah, well, a little bit earlier.
A little bit earlier. Okay. So that's a logic change. So I would analyze all the progress first, and then at the end of the schedule, incorporate each logic change. And it looks like, you know, and this here is not even necessarily a logic change. Maybe this is it's real progress.
Yeah,
right?
It's an actual, yes.
So you saw in my example where I showed two activities, just for 1 second, maybe show this, because maybe similar will help us understand.
Scenario.
This. Yeah, similar scenario. What was it, this one? This was a logic change, but there's, it was these two here. So from this area B 1000 to area B 1010, you can see, and this is important for all of our understanding, this in the baseline was sequential. In reality, there was a little bit of an overlap, but it wasn't not something I would call a logic change. It's just that the progress happened a little bit earlier than planned. I would call this out of sequence progress in general. And in specifically, this is minimally out of sequence, you know? I mean, activities, truthfully, it's rare where something needs to be 100.0% complete before its successor can start. But this is minimally out of sequence. Mathematically, I would handle this as out of sequence progress because the successor, which the logic tells me the predecessor must finish and then the successor will start. But what actually happened is slightly before the predecessor finished, the successor started. So that's an out of sequence progress. In this scenario over here, nothing has started, but this is a logic change. So somebody changed a plan. The original plan was, I'm going to do these two things in sequence. The new plan is, no, I can do them in parallel. And maybe both plans are reasonable. So that's a pure logic change. There are times where you might have activities that are in progress that are affected by both out of sequence progress and logic changes. I'll use the same rule. Analyze progress first, and then logic changes second. So in your example, I think right here in this zone, because there's real progress being reported, and because some of these little links are being violated, that's fine. That's maybe just a little bit of out of sequence progress, incorporate that. And then if there's also logic changes being made, incorporate that second. So you probably have analyzed all the progress. Now you can make each logic change. When you say you run out of duration, I think what you're talking about is duration changes, maybe. And this is what I can describe. In analyzing progress, it is kind of impossible. What's a good word to use here? I don't think it's mathematically feasible or mathematically relevant to analyze negative progress. I treat negative progress as a revision. I'm not using the term logic change, but it's a change. So in other words, what are we changing? When you're evaluating progress, you're always asking yourself constantly, how long is it going to take for me to finish this activity? And when you're reporting progress, this is a mathematical way to think about when people report progress. They're always asking themselves conceptually, how long is it going to take me to get done? All right. So if I have an activity that's a 5-day activity, how long is it going to take me to get done? 5 days, right? If I started the activity and I work on it today, at the end of the day, I go in and I report activity started, remaining duration 4. How long is it going to take me to get done? 4 days. Why? Because I made a day of progress. So every time somebody updates a schedule, they're reporting progress in that way. Did I start? And what's my remaining duration? Always think of updates as people telling you how long it's going to take them to be done things. Reporting a finish date is the same as saying my remaining duration is 0. When somebody tells you the remaining duration is 0 on an activity, that activity is done. So now we kind of have a mathematical set of rules that we can use to analyze schedules. And this is important because it's objective. Run your mathematical objective first and opinion second, right? That's the same reason we analyze progress first and then logic changes second, because progress we can do much more mathematically, and logic changes gets to be a little bit more open to viewpoint. So the opinion stuff I think should always come second. That'll help you keep your analysis more objective. So how do I analyze these, let's say, places where I run out of duration? So what happens is sometimes, and it can happen both ways. Let me do the easy one first. At the end of a period, somebody had an activity that had 5-day remaining duration at the beginning of the period. They tell you the activity started mid-period, and then at the end of the period, they tell you it has 8 days left, right? This happens frequently. What is it? It's negative progress. There's no such thing as negative progress, though. What's another way to look at it? It's a revision of their estimate for how long it would take to execute that activity. So it has the same analytical placement as a logic change in that it's not a report of progress. If somebody told you they had an activity that they thought would take 5 days and they made a day of progress, but at the end of the period, it's going to take 8 days, they actually made no progress. What happened during the period is that they revised the estimated or expected duration for the activity. If they told you it started on September 15th and that now on October 1st, for example, it has 8 days left, what they did is they revised their expectation. They made no progress at all in that activity. They simply decided, I had an activity that I thought would take 5 days. Now I realize, and you can dig into the details, maybe they actually had a problem. I learned that, you know, what I thought was going to be an easy excavation actually has a lot of rock in it, and it's not going to take me 5 days. It's going to take me 8 more days, even though I already worked on it for 10. It's 18 days. That's a revision which should be analyzed after you analyze all progress. Does that capture your situation, or you actually have something different where a person told you something was going to take them 5 days and now they tell you at the end of the period that it's only going to take them 2 days? That's fine too. If somebody had a 5-day activity and they actually got it done in 2 days, then they made better than expected progress. And if it was critical and nothing else popped up on the critical path, they should experience 3 days of savings. If at the end of the period, they simply, let's say, made better than expected progress, but the activity is not done. Let's say you had an activity that was 20 days, right? That only had 10 available work days in the period. But at the end of the period, they say there's only 2 days of duration left. That's okay. They reported 18 days of progress in 10 available work days. That's better than expected progress. And if it's on the critical path, they should experience some savings. If they made logic changes as well, then you analyze those things again, and maybe they revised future logic and there's more savings, but you can analyze all those things. I don't know, I'm gonna have to understand more to find out like where your sticking point is, because all those things can be done regardless of the situation.
No,
and this looks like a pretty straightforward path to me here.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think that, was very clarifying. I mean, what was kind of surprising to me is that typically you find the little yellow bars to the right of the red bars rather than behind the red bars, because at the end of the day, the yellow bars are the future. I mean, the next schedule rather than the schedule before. And so basically the way we did the analysis in 3.4 is by extending the durations of the critical path of previous month to match the new critical path in the baseline. However, in this case, this is what I have to subtract durations in order to match it to bring it backwards. And that's where the thing was crazy to me at the beginning, and I just had to do so.
This project actually, you know, it's got logic changes, but let's say all this is valid, that everything you're looking at here is valid. What you're looking at is actually a good thing. You're looking at a project that actually we thought in July was going to take longer than now we think it's going to take in August. So this is a common thing that people do often to recover delay. Is we experience some delay and then we make some logic changes. Often people only make the logic changes necessary to recover the delay, but sometimes maybe they made better than expected progress in a month, and the update actually shows that the project's going to finish earlier than the prior schedule did. That's great news. I think maybe your problem is you're too used to projects being delayed, and now you see one that actually got recovered a little bit, and it's like, oh no, how do I analyze this? But it's actually a good thing. I agree with the way you're doing it. I just think that, you know, maybe you probably had some delay during the month. You analyzed all the delay. After you analyze the delay, you need to analyze the logic changes that then recovered the delay. That's another good reason to do it in that sequence, because usually what happens is at the end of the week or at the end of the month, people go in and report their progress, and then they change the data date. When they change the data date, they find out that their project got delayed, and then they start making logic changes to recover the delay. So we analyze it in the same way that they actually prepared a schedule update. And then, you know, what's funny is sometimes you'll have a meeting with people and they'll say, oh no, I need to tell you this. I changed this logic. And you'll say, yeah, I saw that. And then they'll say, yeah, but you don't know why I changed it. And you'll say, no, yeah, I do know why you changed it. You changed it because the curbs at, you know, at station 250 were delayed. And they'll say, how did you know that? And you say, because I analyzed your progress first, and then I analyzed your logic changes, and I saw that you were making the logic changes to recover the delay that had been caused by a lack of progress in that area. Because you're analyzing the schedule in the exact way that the scheduler was actually preparing the schedule, you know?
Yeah, well, thank you, Mark, for that input. I appreciate that.
All right, well, hopefully that works out. I can flip this example and show you in the same way those issues that you're seeing, because in this one as well, I made some logic changes to it that I think would show basically the same thing. So, but thank you, everybody. If anybody wants to say, oh, and I'll show you, if you don't understand from Danilo's example, since he's you know, very familiar with that project, I can show you maybe a similar, let's say, effect on this project as well. Let's go to my baselines. I'm going to drop this baseline off and switch this around for you. So let's restore my copy of my baseline. And I'm going to open the copy and show it to you Danilo's way, if my computer will cooperate with me. Here. Let's go to my copy of the baseline. All right, so now don't believe what you see on your screen in yellow because it's not real. Let's go to the baselines, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my copy of the baseline, and now I didn't take the time to make a copy of it, so normally I would make a copy, but I'm going to attach this first update, and then I'm going to go and assign baselines, and I'm going to drop the first update in here, and we're going to do this little analysis. So now we got the reds and yellows reversed, and you really have to get in. You got to get in your right mental space to do this analysis, right? So now what are we going to do? We see that at the end of the period, we had some shifts. So now in yellow, here's your shift, here's your delay. You see my final completion being delayed. I don't have the milestones shown in the baseline, which is a little confusing, but focus on the bars. My final completion got delayed here by about a week, right? So you can see that. And the yellow bars are showing that update. This is what you're used to seeing. But I can, I can change it more so that actually the yellow bars even come forward. Let's do this analysis first, because I have 2 copies of this little baseline. So this activity, like this, you know what? My bars. This is why I never, like I said, I don't usually believe my my screen. Primary baseline is coming from there. Project, assign baselines. That's the first update. That's the first update. Okay. I know that I had different baseline finish. 24 September. That one's good. 4 September. 4 September. I thought in that first update I reported different dates there. I'm not believing these dates on my screen. So here's a tricky thing here. So this is what I'm going to do. Maybe I made a mistake, and this is perfect because I did this very quickly this morning, and now I'm seeing something I don't believe. So maybe I made a mistake here, but I don't know. When I don't believe what I see on my screen, I'm going to drop this baseline off and go to that file and open it, because I think I'm seeing something funky here that I'm making a mistake. Yeah, that's always helpful, but I think this thing didn't refresh when I changed out the baselines. Let's watch. I'm going to attach this and do a refresh here. There's something here I don't like that I certainly could have made a mistake, but I'm just going to check. I don't know if like my process of checking all this stuff, but you're really seeing how the sausage gets made now. Let's restore that. Let's see what, just to make sure I'm on the right page before I explain this. Projects. Oh, okay. Now I know where to get my mind in the right space here. Okay. I really thought I gave this sucker. Oh, you know what? This is a copy of baseline 1. I know now. I know what it is. Okay, so I opened my copy of the baseline instead of opening my update. Let me go to my update. Here's my update. This is the one I wanted to open. Give the computer a second. Okay, so here's the update that I wanted to check. And you can see that this very first activity actually finishes on September 11th. That's its actual finish date that I was showing you before. And here's the area B actual finish. So I'm just going to refresh this data real quick just to make sure, because I was changing logic and things. I think I changed this one back to sequential. Maybe I can even set you up in a situation that's a little bit more similar to what Danilo was experiencing here. I'm going to give you this logic change here, where let's say the scheduler says, oh, area B is delayed and area A is delayed, but the owner is responsible for this problem in area A, and I'm going to work to recover my problems in area B. And maybe that's okay. So maybe the contractor decides, it's my duty to recover my own delay in area B, but the owner is going to have to pay me to recover the delay in area A. And maybe that's reasonable in this case. So maybe the contractor decides, I'm going to do these 2 things. It's not going to be convenient, but there's 2 things here I'm going to do in parallel. So he changes that logic and look, recovers the schedule in area B just enough to reduce it back to 0 total float, but leaves the delay in area A, submits it to the owner and says, okay, you're responsible for delaying the project. You got to pay me for another 6 days. And the owner says, well, wait a minute. You're not telling me the full story. I even agree with you because you're giving me a good model here, but I want you to be honest with me. What actually happened is we were both responsible for delaying the project last month. But now this month, you've changed your plan in area B to recover that delay. And I'm good with that. I like the fact that you've changed the plan to recover your delay. But don't think that I don't see those things. You were delayed too, and now you're recovering it. I'll tell you what, I'm going to do something to recover my delay, but let's be honest with each other, right? So people do this all the time, and everybody needs to get into mindset that we can do better planning if we tell people what our thinking is, because this is just a model. And if we try to mislead people, we're going to create more confusion than it's worth. So I would say, don't try to mislead people. Explain the changes that you're doing and why you're doing them. All right, so now I have this update, right? And in one case it's delayed, and I'm even going to help you maybe in area B if we want to analyze it. Let's make it go even faster. So I only got back to the original plan. Let's really drop it back. And in this next logical relationship, I'm going to overlap them a little bit. B1050. And I'll give you a finish to finish 2 here. All right, so I like to do these in parallel, kind of laddering start to start and finish to finish, just to make sure I have a nice clean network with all my ties. You know, I don't usually like to just do a finish to finish, because every activity I like to have at least one predecessor to its start and at least one successor from its finish. So now you've pulled area B back even earlier than the baseline. That's great. That's similar to like the situation Danilo saw, right? So let's close this up. And let's target it back to the original baseline and see what we can have. Well, I didn't even need to close it, did I? Let's open it up. You can see how much, you know, I need to keep my skills sharp, right? Because I'm not touching Primavera every day anymore. You know, once you become a manager, your skills start to fade away. I'm getting old. Give my screen a minute to refresh. My screen is trying to think, but my computer's struggling between Zoom and everything else. There you go. All right, so now I have update 1. And come on, screen.
Shouldn't you have the baseline open and then this update being the target schedule?
I'm going to target the baseline to this update. I'm just having a problem here with my screen refresh. It ended up getting so slow that I can barely see the buttons on my screen. So what I'm going to do is similar to what you were looking at in your example, where this is the update. And in this case, it's the first update. So the baseline is the prior update, right? So what I'm going to, oh, you want me to do it the other way, like you were doing in your example? Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it that way. Let's do it. Let's do it that way. It's easier to show things one way. So let's go back to the baseline and do it. We'll actually do it on the screen. Let's open up the baseline.
That's the baseline.
Yeah. What I'm going to do is I'll take this copy of the baseline and I'll update it to match the new critical path. That's what we want.
Exactly.
All right, so let's do that live here. We'll take update 1, which we just played with a little bit, and we'll attach it as a baseline. Like I said, always make copies before you attach these as baselines, but in this case, we're not going to take the time. And we're going to put it there, and let's see if we can see it, and we'll show the bars. Hopefully everything looks good so I can show you on my screen. And you know what? Then I need to change my baselines to make sure.
For whatever the reason, it's not showing the delay in the first two parallel activities in there.
I'm not buying it. Yeah, we're getting a bug there. We might have to just go off the dates. Second for this thing. Let's do that. So, I have baseline 1 starts. Doesn't want to show it. Yeah, it doesn't want to show up, does it? That's why I said watching out for these types of bugs.
When you were talking about these specialized software or new packages, I mean, would Acumen Fuse be one of them?
Yeah, I mean, Acumen is an analytical package. I'm talking about, so this is not something that Acumen Fuse or even Acumen 360 does. The Acumen guys might be building more tools into it, but now that Acumen's been sold by Innate, I don't even know if they're building more features. I'm not sure about that. The packages I'm referring to, and again, I'm not recommending any of this stuff, but it exists in the world. One of them is out. It's called Smart PM, and it does dynamic observational analysis. The other one is, I don't think commercially available yet, but it's called, no, I'm forgetting the name of it, Steel Ray. Steel Ray is working on a dynamic observational analysis package. So those are both new to do this type of analysis. Here's my baseline here. That's fine. Here's my, this is the one I messed with. We're almost there. It's either going to work or it's not going to work, and you're going to see why, whether we can do it. Let's do it. And if we find a bug, it'll be a good example to show you that in this particular installation of Primavera, I'm getting a bug. So here's my update. We can very clearly see, for example, this activity B1000 is completed on September 9th. I'm going to refresh the data on my screen. I'm going to reschedule the project. B1000 completed on September 9th. This is getting some baseline data. So here's a thing. Project assign baselines. So there's no, so this is interesting. I would call this a buggy software. I don't think, give me your view on this, but I don't think you can call this user error. I have a project with no baselines assigned except current project, right? However, my baseline 1 is giving me in this column a different date than the current project. Meanwhile, my baseline is assigned as current project. I don't like that. It's very buggy.
What version you have? 16 what?
This is 16.2 implementation, I think. And I don't know if, honestly, when they clean up bugs, sometimes they introduce new bugs. So yeah. I don't trust it, but I can clear this data. So let's go to assign baseline. One thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop, force this, force a refresh of the baseline data. That's really terrible because it shouldn't be pulling from that column anyway. It should be pulling from the real data. Let's do it assign. Let's try maintain. And let's add a primary baseline and see if I can force I'll force an update of that data from the original baseline. Let's see if I can do that. Force that. That's fine. I don't know if I even want to do it. You know what I can do? Let's do this.
Don't you have to select there in, yeah, okay.
I'm going to do something different. I'm trying to force this column to update because this column, baseline 1, thinks it's showing, for example, the current project, but it's in fact not showing the current project. It's showing something different. So what I'm going to do is I'll force an update this way. I'm going to maintain baselines, and I'm going to add a copy of the current project as a new baseline. And then I'll close this, and I'm going to actually assign that copy. Hopefully it came through clean. Instead of the current project, the copy I just made of the current project, assign that and force another refresh. And then I'll just look at actual dates. It's not going to pick up the actual dates at all. It won't do it. September 4th. No, it's not going to pick up on the actual dates. That's fine. It's just not going to show it. It's just not going to show it. You're not going to be able to see it for that activity because it will not. So on this implementation, it will not pull actual dates through in these baseline dates. It's only going to pull through internally calculated early start dates, which is a little bit perhaps too confusing to get into for the purpose of this analysis. But this is the date that I'm pulling in. So all I'll say is always double check the data that you're getting, because the way that this targeting is happening can tend to be very confusing. And when you're stepping through an analysis, set it up. Here's a type of thing where, you know, if I see something funky happening on the screen, I'll break it out and go back to the original schedule, but I'm going to incorporate progress based on the real schedules, not just based on, you know, what my screen might be showing me through these baseline functions. What I'll do for the purpose of this, just to wrap this up, is I'll baseline this against, I will baseline this against the copy of the baseline right here.
I want to try to pull simply BL start instead of BL1 start and see.
I could see if that'll give us a different,
Mark, which other software will be less buggy than P6, perhaps Asta or?
I think Asta is less buggy, frankly. But the challenge I have with, you know, that is everybody uses P6. So I'm happy enough to stick with P6. I just always, you know, like to go through and be very, very careful with it because it really is very buggy. Let me do that. You know what all I'm going to do is I'm going to swap out these columns for, since that's only going to pull through the internally calculated early start dates, just something to be aware of. I am going to pull to start with the actual dates, and I can show those actual start and actual finish in this. So before the internally calculated dates, I'm going to drop in these baseline actual dates. Okay, and those will not come through. Oh, because it's the old baseline. Okay. Maybe I did show this right project.
Yeah, but still you have actual dates in there, should be shown.
So there you go. I'm not totally losing my mind. Now we got it. There you go. That's good. All right, so let's set up. So all this normally we would do at the start of an analysis. This is what we wanted to do. So framing your analysis, you really got to see it live here. I apologize for all the delays and sloppiness, but you know, maybe we learn something from this in that, you know, we look for errors until we set up something that we're testing against. I like to PDF all the schedules, and as another rule of thumb, when you submit an XER schedule to somebody, always give them a PDF with it as well. And when you're taking submittals, take both an XER file and a PDF. That way, when you import the XER file, if you have any kind of different database setup, which is common, that affects the data, you'll be able to double check against the PDF to see if any dates are changing, things like that. A lot of these bugs have been cleaned up over time, but as they introduce new features, there's always the opportunity for more bugs. Now I see something that makes a lot of sense to me, and I won't, you know, waste any more of your time trying to clean up things. But, you know, always have a view of what you expect the computer to show you, so that when you see something that's not consistent with that view, you can recognize it. This now makes a lot of sense to me, so I'm happy to keep going now. Now what we want to do is what Danilo was saying, which is look at the delay and figure out where it happened. And I think now you can see where it happens, stepping through. You want to come back to what, the original baseline or the other one? I wanted to do it the other way, but you want to look at this path, or? I don't know, we were able to do it this way. It's the other way where we can't get the view to make any sense. So, you know, maybe we're not gonna spend any more time on it, because I really wanted to do it the other way, but I just couldn't get that view to show us what we want to see. We'd have to do it maybe offline. I didn't really set this one up for that type of analysis. I had framed it up to do it the other way. So fortunately, I really want to give it the way that you did yours, so I could show you the process in a little bit more detail, but I might have to give up on that ability here. So let's try one last thing. Let's go to my original baseline instead of the copy. Open that one up. Try and force it to baseline against update 1.
Now, question, is this an unusual way of doing it, like putting the target schedule to be the update rather than the baseline? Because usually what we do is we take the previous period and set it as the target schedule rather than the most current period. So
no, it's definitely a good way to do analysis. You just got to watch out for making sure you're getting good data. I like having everything on one screen, frankly. That makes things a lot easier. Another way to do it is to keep one schedule open as a PDF and have the other one open in Primavera and do your analysis that way. But, you know, it's definitely good to have all this stuff on one screen so you can really line things up the way you're saying. I would just be cautious, always cautious when you're doing a comparison. I don't like necessarily what these bars show. I might be able to modify that, you know, for example. But right now, let's see, primary baseline. Just in case we don't get any errors there. So maybe like ignore the bars and look at actual dates in your columns here. That's good. Let's drop in these actual dates one more time to see if it pops up for you. Actual start. There you go. At least we have the actual dates there. So now with the dates shown on your screen, you can see clearly that this activity ended September 11th, and we don't want to rely on the bar. Again, the bar in this case is reporting internally calculated early start and early finish dates, which aren't overridden by the actual dates in this instance. Mm-hmm. It's a you know, it can create a lot of confusion, but, you know, look to dates, don't necessarily look at the bars you see on your screen. It mostly affects activities that are in progress or sometimes activities that are completed where you can't really get the bars to show up the way you want them to. If you're running implementations, I think we're up to release 18 maybe now. If you're running release 18, hopefully this little issue on targeting has been corrected. I don't know, but I wouldn't assume necessarily that it has been. Just be very cautious and, you know, make sure you're looking at good data on your screen when you do this type of comparison. So now the question is, in the yellow is the path in the new update, and I want to incorporate, you know, all the progress from the other update. What I would say is, you know, I made this comment about analyzing progress in terms of when things start. We know this activity started on August 31st, right? And we know it didn't finish by September 5th. But what if I push the data to this schedule? I'll do what I said I was going to do here and create for you a potential idea of a schedule update that exists on the morning of Friday, September 4th. And I schedule to that date. So here is both of these activities now looking against what actually happened in the update. And this is what happened. And let's say we have affirmative reports from the site of progress, but then they didn't finish on time. So what happens the next day? Well, this was Friday, September 4th, and they didn't finish. So let's go to Monday, September 7th. Neither one of them makes progress and we get a day of delay. It looks like a big bump because we crossed over the weekend, right? Now we're on Monday, September 7th. What that really is, and now we can see how the overall schedule shows a -1. So because these two activities did not make affirmative progress on Friday, September 4th, they both on that day caused a 3 calendar day delay to the project because they bumped out over a weekend and pushed the whole project -1 work day. Let's go here to the end. We're still looking at a comparison to the other schedule, but we can see in our current analysis schedule, we bumped out to November 6th. All right, so somewhere else in the schedule, there's an activity that probably only got, that had a weekend where it didn't get bumped over the weekend, but we bumped everything 1 work day. On the next day, and this is how you could have 1,000 other activities in this schedule that have 3, 4, 5 days afloat. You're not analyzing them. So even in a 10,000 activity schedule, you're drilling down to the 1 or 2 paths that are driving the schedule. In this case, we happen to have 2 paths that are driving the schedule. But the very next day, what happens on September 7th? This activity starts, and we know that because we can see the start date here. So let's say on September 7th, this activity, which it looks like is going to start September 8th, we know it actually started on September 7th. So let's report it started on September 7th. And instead of 7 days left, it made a day of progress, which means we're only going to have 6 days left, right? This path still doesn't make any progress, and this activity still doesn't complete because this activity doesn't complete until September 9th. So let's pump out 1 more day, and we're only parsing down to this one tiny piece of the schedule, so we're going to pump out 1 more day, and this is what happened. You see this little gap here, that's okay because we have retained logic.
Yeah.
But now you see that this path at the top is -2, this is only -1. Longest path mentality here, this is the path now that's driving the project. You can make this argument. We had the 2 schools of thought on negative total float versus longest path. This is the critical path. If I run a longest path filter on this overall schedule, you're going to see, let's go to longest path. Okay, bang, B disappears because A is the longest path. If I go to, default definition for critical in Primavera, everything's going to come up because everything's negative. But I could change that default definition. I could say that things are critical if they have 5 days afloat, and I could get more stuff. This is everything in the schedule, so I'm not going to give you more stuff here.
Mark, can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Mark, I'm trying to correlate this with a scenario of 2 of my subcontractors. Let's say, for example, for the purpose of correlation, let's say area A is under 1 subcontractor. Actually, I have a case of 1 subcontractor doing the chilled water works connection from the chilled water plant to my project inside the premises. And there is another subcontractor who is doing the HVAC works inside the building. Now, both of them have to complete at certain point, and the inside contractor has to complete their flushing works so that he can take on the water from the external party. And the external party has to complete their drilling works, and they have to complete their piping up to the point of the project boundary. Now, the party who is doing the external works, for me, it's an actual case. They are an honest guy, and they reported to me at some point that they are facing some problems during drilling, and it's going to take another 2 weeks to complete the connection. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, I have an update that says that I'm going to complete 2 weeks later. Now, the party who is doing the works inside, from the experience of what he's doing and how he's progressing, we know that he's not going to finish on that date, but he will not give an accurate update. He will just tell me that I'm going to finish 2 days later. After 2 days, he will say another 2 days later. So his update is progressively showing delays, whereas the other date is showing all of a sudden jump of 2 weeks. Now, in hindsight, the situation was that the external party completed the works, and even after that, the internal party was still progressing. So if this concept which you said just now, it's a very interesting concept. You're basically saying that unless I know when it is actually going to finish, every day after the planned finish date, I will be assuming that it'll be finishing the next day. So in this, if I follow this method, the party who is being honest to me is going to fall on the critical path just because he is telling the truth.
Right. Right. So now how do you work? This is a good question. How are you going to work in that situation? And I'll take your word on the honesty of the two parties, right? So how do you work this out? Well, you know, you need to find a way to bring pressure on a person who's continually giving you inappropriate updates. Now, you probably have some contract terms that require, you know, things like coordination, the fact that he's even giving you any schedule update. I mean, if you have a really obstinate party, you know, when you asked him, when are you going to be done? He might say, I'm not even going to tell you, or I'll be done when I'm done. That's how you'll know. And my contract doesn't require me to tell you anything. That would be real obstinacy. Here, he's telling you I'll be done in 2 days, and you're saying effectively, well, that's not reasonable. Maybe it'd be possible. So go back to my possible, practical, permissible idea, right? What I think you're saying is his statement that I'll be done in 2 days is not reasonable. And he's proven to you in the past that his estimates on how long it's going to take are either intentionally or unintentionally false. So what if you could demonstrate to him, say, well, this is interesting. You're telling me that you'll be done in 2 days, but I don't see the resources, and looking at the amount of work that has to be done, can you tell me what's going to happen? 2 days means what? Tomorrow and the next day? Which portion of the work are you going to do tomorrow and which the next day? And I see too much work here. I don't see that you're going to be done in 2 days. I see 2 weeks of work. Maybe the person continues to lie to you, but it's hard to kind of lie in a lot of detail. And you say, okay, well, all these things that you've told me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to document all this, that this was your plan, all right? But I think it's going to take a lot longer. And if it turns out that I'm right and you're wrong, then I'm going to analyze the schedule based on what I believe was your reasonable plan, because I don't believe what you're telling me is reasonable. So I'll go back to my reasonable, unreasonable, and analyzing schedules, because you're right in the situation that the guy that's being honest is going to get punished. You are rightly trying to prevent that. How do you prevent that? You need to have some basis for saying which contractor is honest, which is not. I like your basis on, well, the one guy has always been true to his deadlines in the past, so I like to believe his information. But I would think, you know, you have other avenues to put some pressure on the other guy, and that in the end, if he ultimately takes 2 weeks, you don't say that, well, you became critical back on that day because you ultimately were wrong. The reason he's critical back on that day is because you didn't believe his forecast on the front in the beginning, and you now have an alternative forecast available, which was your own, which you also shared with him. So I think the fact that you've shared the information, and again, I'm not parsing your contract here, I'm trying to give a path that could work in any situation. You've actually shared your viewpoint with him at the time. So now, after the fact that you're going to apply that viewpoint is no surprise, because not only did you turn out to be right, but you actually shared it with him on the front end. And now you can make a statement to him and say, you know what, you were always on the critical path, and I shared with you the reason why then, and I shared with you the idea that maybe you should be expediting your work, and you chose not to. So now I'm in a situation where you had all the information I had, and I'm going to make an argument that you were actually critical at that time. And now what you've done is, because his contemporaneous forecast was wrong, as I'll go back to the other statement I made, if you're going to say that something's incorrect, you need another source of data that is correct. If you're forming that after the fact, that's just an opinion. But if you shared a forecast at the time, now you have another source of data that was contemporaneous because you shared it and documented it, and it turned out to be correct. So now you can go back and say, on that day, in fact, your forecast was not the only contemporaneous forecast. There was another one from me. Which one do I think was more reliable? I think the one that was more reliable is the one that proved to be true, mine. And therefore, I'm going to go into that point in my analysis, and I'm not going to use your forecast, which turned out to be wrong. I'm going to use my forecast, which turned out to be correct. But what I don't like is people doing that. You know, I like the idea of people doing that contemporaneously and sharing it. What I don't like is if you went through after the fact and say, well, when you told me that you know, you were going to take 2 days, it really ended up taking 2 weeks. And because it did, I'm going to go back in time and assume it was going to take you 2 weeks, and then say you were critical because of that and you lied to me. There's too much opportunity for, I could go after the fact to any project and say, oh, everything, you know, took longer than you planned, and you knew that at the time, you were just lying to me. Once we assume that the data people that are giving us are lies, there's almost no point in doing a schedule, because everything could fall apart. So you have to have something contemporaneous you could point to. This is the idea of collapsed as built as well, is the only thing that's true is what ultimately happened. But you can't measure what happened against what happens. You need to have a plan at the beginning of the project. And I'm giving you a way to maybe contemporaneously. I think if you're going to contest somebody's forecasts, you should do so contemporaneously, and you should not generally do so after the fact, you know? Because after the fact, it's no longer a forecast, right?
That's very true. Yes.
So be honest with the guy and share it with him contemporaneously. And then I think if you've done that, you have a right to go back to your contemporaneous forecast, you know?
Yeah, true.
Thank
you. Thank you.
This to your discussion. It's very interesting. Thank you. From my experience, the only time where I go little by little is when I'm updating procurement to show if there is a construction activities going on. For example, we're expecting to be delivered something in 2 weeks, but I mean, it actually will arrive in 2 weeks, but we expected it to arrive earlier. Mm-hmm. So in order not to overshadow the procurement item to be on a critical path, but still show what's going on site while they're waiting for the material equipment to arrive on site. So I prioritize that to show on the critical path while we still have a float, we still have time for the procurement to arrive. And then once it did not arrive on that date that we needed it, then it becomes either concurrent or primary critical path.
Right. I'm saying, so this is a mathematical way to do things. There's plenty of people in the world that'll say, well, you know, you can't really parse it this tightly because everything's just an estimate. And I'm fine with all of that. But what I'm saying is there is a way to parse things very tightly. And I encourage you to share this with people and say, let's look at when we say something is critical, the math of the computer, I can tell you that the computer parses these things down to the minute. So the fact that people might say, oh, well, that's not, really reality to parse things by the day. You can say, well, that's fine, but this is the schedule that we're using to manage the project. And the schedule is generated by a computer that whether we like it or not, and I don't like it, but whether we like it or not, the computer is parsing these things down to the minute. So for us to just say, well, you can't parse things by the day and then rely on a schedule that's done by a computer is also a little silly. I would encourage people to say, you know what, I'm going to be reasonable and I'm not going to argue that we should necessarily always parse things down to the day. But if we have a lot of complex things going on 1 week and we're trying to come to an agreement reasonably on what's critical or whether two things are equally critical, I would say to you, we should parse things down to the day. And if it gets within a couple of days and we can come to an agreement that they're equally critical, let's come to that agreement, but let's do it based on an understanding of our schedule and an understanding of, you know, how critical something is. Let's have those discussions, because if we're thinking just in general terms, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks is close enough to be on the critical path, we're not being objective. That's not what the computer is doing. The computer is parsing it down to the minute. Let's agree to look at the schedule and get together with the other party and say, you know, if things are within a day or two of the critical path, we should be discussing them. And we should be discussing whether the model in the CPM software is accurate. Does it reflect our true understanding of the critical path? Is it inaccurate? Are you intentionally giving me an inaccurate model to try and push your understanding of the project? All those discussions need to be had. Very important. Let me parse out a tiny bit of the more complex. I'll wrap this up. I know we've been going a long time here. Let me parse out a tiny bit of this complex portion of the path just so you can see some of the effects, because I think this is these are the things you want to know, and whether you choose to parse at this level of detail or not is up to you. But it's good to know that you can do this. I gave you this one day of out of sequence, and I showed you how this activity drops off the longest path, which I think is very important. That to me is a critical path shift on that day. And you have this chain in area A as the sole longest path, and what I would arguably call the sole critical path pushing the one milestone on this project as of that day. What happens the next day? Well, this activity we can see makes another day of progress, because at the end of the period, I'm forgetting now, but at the end of the period, let's see if we can pull up that I have the target remaining durations. This activity has only 2 days left at the end of the period. So it made 5 days of progress during the period. Let's give it another day of progress. So I'll drop the RD down to 5. All right, so he makes a day of progress. This activity actually finishes on the 9th. So what's today? The morning of the 8th. So he's not done today. This activity doesn't finish to the 11th. This one doesn't start until the 16th. All right, so I looked at the couple activities that are right on the critical path, and let's bump the data date forward one more day and see what happens. All right, so we see this activity, we know made a day of progress. These guys still continue to bump out. Where's the critical path? Well, look, now A is -3 and B is still -1. Why is B -1? Not because this activity is making progress, but because the successor is making progress. And that continues to, relative to area A, make area B less and less critical, okay? What happens the very next day? Next day, this guy continues to make another day of out of sequence progress. So we're going to drop his RD down to 4. What happens to this activity? Well, now it's the 9th and this activity actually finishes on the 9th. So close it out. Because this activity made a day of progress on the 9th by finishing, and its successor made a day of progress on the 9th, we're going to get a bonus that day because we really made 2 days of progress on the path because both activities made a day of progress. Meanwhile, up here on this path, we don't make any more progress. We only have 1 day. If we make 1 more day of progress, we're going to be done, and we're not done on the 9th. So it's going to end up bumping out. Let's see what happens. Bump out to the 10th. All right, now look at this. All of a sudden, we're back on schedule on this path here. We're right back on schedule. That's with the logic change is not yet incorporated because although we had some delay, we made enough out of sequence progress to recover that delay and get back on schedule. Look at this path though, in area A, it's now at -4, right? So right now for this short period of time, it looks like we're doing okay in area B. Area A continues to be delayed. 1 or 2 more days here. Let me see how we're doing. Let's drop out some of these columns so it'll be easier to see. Hide some of these silly things that we don't even need because all I really need is the RD and the actually reported dates. Get rid of those. All right, so what happens the next day? Now it's the 10th. This activity does not complete. This activity here, does he make another day of progress? Yeah, he does, because he's only got 2 left at the end of the period. So let's credit that progress. The one above is done, so we don't have to worry about that anymore. We're going to credit 1 day of progress here, and we're not going to credit any progress on the 10th. Let's bump forward to the 11th. Just going day by day, very carefully here, so we can see what's happening in the schedule. This path, you can see, to Danilo's point, we've exactly aligned here. So at least on this activity, we don't have to worry about. These are starting to come into alignment, right? Next day, this one makes 1 more day of progress, but then we're out of progress because we have 2 days left, and that's all the progress we made on the whole period. This guy on the 11th, he finally wraps up. So on the 11th, he's finished, and we can bump out now. The 11th of September is a Friday, so we're going to bump all the way out to Monday the 14th and schedule, right? And there we go. We still stayed in alignment right here, and up here we're starting to come into alignment. What happens the next day? We can see that, remembering at this point in the project, this sequence through B has 0 days of delay, but remember all the way back on September 4th, B was actually concurrent with A and had contributed to a couple days of delay just concurrently between B and A. And it was only after, I think, September 8th it was, or September 7th. Yeah, after September 7th, on the morning of September 8th, A became solely critical. So there's still a little bit of concurrent delay from early in the analysis if we're making notes of every day when A and B were concurrently critical, and then on the morning of September 8th, A became critical. All the delay since then has been solely associated with area A. We go 1 more day and look, B can't make any more progress. A, okay, you got this 1 activity done, but the next activity, which should start on Monday, September 14th, doesn't actually start until Wednesday, September 16th. So no more progress in A and no more progress in B. What happens? We bump forward to the 15th. And we see, oh, a delay. This one didn't get done, maybe. This one, This one did not get done. No, no more progress in B. He's still going to go all the way to the end of the period. Apologies for the goofy Primavera misalignment on the colors, but this activity doesn't start until the 16th. So no more progress to report here because at the end of the period, he still had 2 days left and I've got my remaining duration already down to 2 days. So let's bump forward even one more day to the morning of the 16th. Push it out. Now you can see this is perfectly in alignment. And down here, we're starting to go negative again. So you see what's happening in B if we start to parse. And I think I haven't told you things from some reality that's different than what you're seeing in the schedule here. This is really what's happening. Remember that first week of September, B was kind of delayed, but then it made better progress and got back on schedule. Now you can see B is kind of not making progress and it's starting to get delayed again, but A is still more critical. So all of this, if this is a good schedule, and I'll say for the purpose of an input, this is a good schedule. Parsing it like this shows you what's really happening on the project day by day. Next day, what happens? This activity does actually start. So let's report it started. Nothing else happens in B. There's no further activity down here. I've already reported this progress and none of these activities make any progress during the period. So the next day I'm going to go to, let me remember to report 1 day of progress here. Go from 7 down to 6. And then I'll move you forward 1 day to the 17th of September. We can see what's happening, schedule it. And the next day of progress, you can see A is now back on track. It's not losing any more days, but it's still -7. But now B is starting to lose a few days. B is starting to catch up now that A is starting to make progress. End of the period, he has 4, so I can credit another day of progress up here. Let's do that and go forward 1 more day from the 17th to the 18th, which is a Friday. There you go. Look, A nice in line. B now is creating a little more delay. Once again, they're getting closer because B is making no progress. There's no progress in area B this mid-September period. It's A that's actually now making some progress. Let's give 1 more day of progress here and go forward 1 more day. And we're going to bounce all the way to the morning of Monday, September 21st. And there's A, and look, B is getting even closer. It's not quite as critical as A, but it's getting more closer because B is not making any progress during this period. A is making progress, but that's it. Unfortunately, after that day, and you can look here, there's no further activity to report in area A on that activity. And we're at the morning of Monday, September 21st. Something else happens on September 21st, though. It looks like this activity starts. Oh, that's great. And at the end of the period, it has 2 days left. So let's give this guy on September 21st a start date. And again, this is more out of sequence progress because it's supposed to be a direct successor, but this activity hasn't finished yet. It starts on September 21st and drops down to a 4-day remaining duration. No more progress in B. I'm going to schedule to the 22nd. With 1 day of progress. All right, and what happened? There's our little 1 day of progress. Don't worry about the yellow bars up there. And now look how close B is getting because still no progress in B. And now we have another activity in A. Even though this one isn't done, it's making a little bit of out of sequence progress. 1 more day of progress up in A. And let's go forward to September 23rd. And now look. B is once again just as critical as A. By September 23rd, all of B's progress was made on these 2 activities and then nothing for a period of time. Whereas A started to make progress on this 3rd activity. And like I said, I never parsed this schedule before. I just made up this update. And now I'm learning things saying, oh, so it was A and B the first week, and then really just A that was causing delay because B had made some progress. Now look, by the end of the month, they're both concurrently critical again. What happens after that? I got 1 more day of progress to credit here. I've got nothing to credit at all for the rest of the month in area B. Let's go forward 1 more day to the 24th. Okay, move forward, and that's it. I've credited all progress on that activity. There's no more activity in A, which is more critical. Oh, guess what? A made 1 more day in progress, and suddenly I just found out on the morning of September 24th, B is actually more critical than A, slightly. and not a single one of these areas makes any progress the rest of the month. What's my data date on the new update? It's actually September 28th, the Monday. So there's no further progress to report. Right now, the project is a -8, and my substantial completion, which is here, is November 3rd. It was originally October 22nd. Final completion is November 17th. That's 8 work days behind schedule. November, I don't think there's no holidays or anything in this calendar. It was originally, I think, November 5th was final completion, and it went 1 to the 6th, and then Monday 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to November 17th. That's my 8 work days of delay showing up as -8. And it's B that's driving. When I bump this schedule out to the data date of the second update, which is the 28th, I'm gonna get another, was it 2 work days of delay? And all associated with that, with area B, because at the end of the month, A is slightly less critical. So look how close these 2 paths are. So what did we just do here? We identified everything that happened during the month, and we identified some critical path shifts. First, they were both critical, then just A, then they were both critical, and then just B, parsing every single day. And then what happens at the end of the month? The contractor in my little scenario here came in and decided to do some logic adjustments. So what's he going to do? Well, in the update, and you can run Claim Digger between the 2 updates to do this. Should we do it? Or are you guys done with this? Let's, well, you know, where go to find your Claim Digger and run the comparison. But this logic was changed so that these 2 activities are going to happen in parallel. If we change it in this schedule here, in our little analysis schedule, we can go start to start and do 10-20 finish to finish, just to make the exact change that was present in the update. I knew there were some other changes made, but we changed that. I did the wrong one, of course. 10 to 20. Exact change that was made in the update. Okay, I wanted this guy and change its successors. Start to start. B1030. Put these 2 in parallel. There you go. I think I might have also changed an original duration here. I forget what else, but you can see that effect already. And now B being only -5. Remembering in the update all this stuff, I think I changed this to a start to start 2, finish to finish 2. So instead of finish to start, this was another change if we were to look at the update logic. Something else that in my little example here, I'm saying the contractor changed to recover all this delay. Make that to bring it back. I'm not quite down to 0 yet, but I'm close. I think he reduced the duration, whatever the case may be. It must have been this one to line it up, right? Then I have to look at the actual schedule again. Change this to 5. There you go. And then F9. And there you go. See, now it lines up perfectly with this. And that's the critical path match that you were looking for, Danilo. Mm-hmm. So now that you, in your analysis schedule, have matched all these logic changes in the new schedule, you're seeing this perfect alignment. You saw I brought it all the way back, though, just like you were trying to bring the red back to the yellow. That's what I did. Now, in this example, B is back to 3, and A is, you know, exactly where, well, I still got to bring A back. So there were also logic changes in A. It's actually this change here where instead of being sequential, again, it's going to happen in parallel. I think the change is actually a start to start 0, finish to finish 0. But because there's still some retained logic here, it's only going to drop the bar back to this portion of this activity that still needs to be completed.
So what I'm lacking in my analysis is that I was not doing the logic change. I was just trying to do the progress change, but I also need to do it because in the exercise that you did, you showed a change, progress, and then logic changes at the end. I say, but in real world, it doesn't happen like that. You just receive one update and God helps you, you know.
Yeah. So you pull in all the progress, you receive one update, first you pull in all the progress, and then you start looking at pulling in all the logic changes, just like I did here. You know, I spent a lot of time putting in progress, and now I'm spending a little bit of time pulling in logic changes. Is there one more little tiny one at the end here? I think so. You know, whatever the case may be. Is it a finish to finish one? That would be a weird. But it looks like there's one other tiny little logic change at the end that we can play with, just to match those two bars perfectly for you at the end. The one thing I'll say with this that is really kind of funky is the fact that when activities are in progress, it doesn't show like this one. And when they report actual dates, these baseline bars in a lot of these implementations, and I could check other releases of P6. This one I just installed to do these little types of demonstrations. But people are running enterprise level databases. They have all different kinds of installations of P6. You never know what you're looking at. So I would always be cautious about the way these bars are showing up and look at real data. But in this case, okay, so we matched them both exactly and all logic changes have been incorporated. Now we can see we've analyzed this November 13th completion date. But remember at the beginning of this analysis, we were saying, oh, we can just look on a broad basis and say all of the delays were created in area A, but that's not what happened. These logic changes in area B don't affect the September period, they affect the October period. What really happened is there were delays in both A and B, and then the contractor made logic changes in B. And I think understanding that, we can now talk about, you know, more intelligently what really happened on the project, because the contractor can't try to present here, or the owner for that matter, can't try to present that there were no changes in B. What they need to present is something that is more true, which is there was a delay in B and then changes to recover that delay. And it's very important to me to parse out delay and then recovery, as opposed to just saying, oh, the net is no delay, because somebody changing a future plan, going back to the other example that I think Friedrich or somebody was giving, you know, somebody changing their future plan to recover delay, that could also just be looked at as hiding delay. And what's important is, are they going to be able to execute those changes? Somebody that's constantly accelerating their plan and never meeting it is going to be a problem on your project. And parsing like this gives you kind of the ammunition to have this discussion of saying, okay, I appreciate all these changes you made, but in fact, you made these changes after the delay had already occurred. And I'm still going to hold you responsible for the delay. Now that you've made these changes to recover it, I'm not going to penalize you at all. I want you to recover it, but know that if you don't recover it, that I already know that that original delay was your responsibility, right? So it just gives you the parsing, and especially if you're parsing the guy's own schedule, you show him, this is the way I'm going to analyze it. I want you to understand that you can't hide things from me. You're going to give me a schedule at the beginning of the month, and you're going to tell me that's your plan. I'm going to measure you against that plan. If you want to change it, that's great. We should change it. We should be dynamic. But we got to talk about changing it. If you're changing it in secret, you're not changing it. You have to communicate those changes to the people that are executing the work. And if you want me to take those changes into account contemporaneously, you have to communicate those changes to me. Otherwise, I'm going to analyze them when you tell me the change. And that means often what you're doing is you're executing a plan, and when it doesn't go well, you make logic changes at the end of the month to try and hide the delay. Don't tell me. If you want to change your plan, tell me contemporaneously, and I'll assume you change your plan contemporaneously. If you hide the changes, I'll assume you made them at the end of the month. I think that's a valid position to have. Share your position with people, and they'll kind of fall into a process that'll work a lot better, I think, for managing the project. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for all the time. I know this was a lot. I love, I want people to understand these methods of delay. And it's very hard for me to do this live because I don't have my head in, my thinking math space. I have it in my more communication space, which is harder. But so thank you for bearing with me as we struggle through this. This is, brand new. You can see in a small schedule, trying to create layouts and stuff. I get a lot of questions on what layouts do you use? How do you set it up? It's good that you get to see some struggles of when you're setting stuff up. Be careful, be detailed in your analysis, be careful with what you're looking at. And you see, I struggle with these same kind of things every day, especially if I'm not doing this stuff hands-on day in and day out. You got to be very careful. So appreciate everybody's time, and thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, Danilo. Thank you, Srijesh,
Thank you.
everyone. Inna, thank you
Thanks,
for your
Mark.
questions.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for your energy.
Thank you.
Okay. Don't forget the next webinar for October 24. Be your question and cases before in order to be analyzed and selected by our team. Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for your cases and a good analysis and debate. So see you in next webinar. Have a
And
good
let's
Thank you, Meili.
share those other resources if you can via email with everybody, Miley. The same ones we shared, I think, last week.
Okay, perfect. No problem. Thanks, Mark.
Meili, you didn't send to me.
Okay, let me verify, Danilo. We are going to check with our team.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
No
I
issues.
think we shared them with the Spanish group, Danilo, and we got you in the English group, so you didn't get them yet. You're going to get them this week.
Okay. No issues. Blessings to everyone.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.